Welcome to winter, now freeze. So, you've somehow been transported back to medieval Europe, which means three things: you're undernourished, underdressed, and overwhelmingly underprepared for what's about to hit you. Winter is coming, and unlike HBO's Dragons and Incest epic, this one doesn't come with fancy cloaks or flaming swords. What you get instead is 6 months of bone-snapping cold, wind that feels like it has a personal vendetta, and snow that's less of a magical wonderland and more of a seasonal death certificate. Let's set the icy stage. The average winter temperature in medieval Europe, especially in the wake of the Little Ice Age, starting in the 14th century, hovered just above your tears freeze before they hit the ground. This was a time before global warming, before the Industrial Revolution, and before central heating, meaning you didn't just experience winter, you wore it on your soul. Forget romantic ideas of snow, gently dusting quaint thatched cottages. Think more wind howling like a banshee, roofs caving under snow weight, and entire rivers freezing solid. And no, you don't get to stay warm just because you're indoors. Indoor heating, that's adorable. What you have is a single fireplace if you're lucky, and a house that was built with more gaps than actual wall. The good news is, your home has great ventilation. The bad news is that it's January, and the ventilation is actively trying to kill you. These homes were made of wattle and daub, basically a medieval version of cardboard and hope, which means insulation was something only bears had. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this. And hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Now you might think, well, at least there's a fire. Sure, except firewood was expensive, scarce, and usually damp. You don't get to just waltz outside and start chopping down trees. Forests were often owned by local lords or the church, and stealing firewood was a crime that could get you fined, flogged, or thrown in a very cold, very real jail. That's assuming you even had an axe to start with, which you don't, because you're a peasant, and tools cost money. So unless you've got a personal relationship with the forest spirits, you're shivering through winter with whatever scraps you can legally scavenge: cow dung, brushwood, or your last bits of dignity. As for windows, oh you sweet summer human. Glass was for churches and rich people. Your window is a hole in the wall covered with animal bladder or oiled parchment, which is basically medieval cling film. It blocks exactly zero cold and occasionally lets in curious wildlife. So even when you're inside, wrapped in the one rack-gnawed blanket your family owns, you're still basically sleeping in a barn, except the animals have fur and you don't. Let's talk about snow. Snow looks nice in modern postcards, where it's heavily filtered and accompanied by a Starbucks cup. Back then, snow was a prison warden. Once it piled up, roads vanished. Trade stopped. Your town became a frozen island of regret. Traveling in winter was so dangerous that most people didn't even try. If you were a medieval traveler in December, you weren't brave. You were lost, drunk, or doomed. Probably all three. And if you were living up north, say in Scotland or Scandinavia, congratulations, you've just unlocked the hardcore survival mode. At this point, people weren't just surviving winter, they were actively redefining what it meant to exist in constant misery. Snowstorms could last for days. Blizzards came without warning. And sometimes, just to spice things up, the sea froze over. That's right, the ocean said, nope, and became a giant medieval ice cube. In villages, people huddled together in cottages with their livestock, not because they liked the smell of sheep in the morning, but because body heat was the only heating system that didn't require firewood or money. Families slept in the same bed, often fully clothed, sometimes even wearing shoes. There were no cozy pajamas, no electric blankets, no cocoa, just the unrelenting hope that nobody rolled into the freezing edge of the straw mattress and froze solid before morning. And here's the really fun part. There was no weather forecasting. You didn't know when the cold would arrive. It just did. Like a tax collector with a personal grudge. People relied on things like animal behavior and grandma's knees to predict the weather. So if one day the birds flew south and your joints started screaming, that was it. Winter was on its way, and once it arrived, it stayed. For months. By the end of January, people weren't asking if someone had died. They were asking how many entire families perished quietly in the night, tucked away in frozen homes while neighbors waited for the spring thaw to discover what had happened. Sometimes, no one even noticed until the snow melted and the stench made itself known. It wasn't uncommon for priests to go door to door, knocking on homes like they were medieval census takers of doom. So no, you don't survive a medieval winter. You endure it. If you're lucky, you suffer through it like an unpaid intern in the internship from hell, clutching your soggy boots and whispering to the sky, "Why does the air hurt my face?" The answer: because history is cold, cruel, and doesn't hand out mittens. You've survived your first breath of medieval winter air. Congrats. Now you just have to survive the building you live in, which is less of a home and more of a medieval wind tunnel with furniture. The only thing your house is insulating is your false sense of hope. Want a warm spot? Try hugging a goat. Let's get this out of the way early. Your house is not warm, cozy, or structurally sound. It's not even particularly house-like. If you're a peasant, and statistically yes you are, then you're living in something called a cruck house. Sounds cozy, right? It's not. It's a kind of hut made with wooden beams, daub and mud, which sounds like something toddlers make in the backyard and then abandon. The walls are often made from a material called wattle and daub, which is basically a prehistoric smoothie of mud, dung, straw, and anxiety, slapped onto a woven lattice of sticks and called wall. The roof, thatched, which, fun fact, means it's made of tightly packed straw layered to keep rain out. It's the medieval equivalent of an overachieving scarecrow. Unfortunately, thatch also makes a fantastic nesting place for rats, birds, fleas, and the occasional bored squirrel looking to redecorate. Oh, and it's flammable. So not only is your house cold, it's also basically a matchstick with a front door. And speaking of doors, don't expect locks, knobs, or hinges that work. Most doors are heavy wooden planks hung unevenly, and many homes don't even have windows, just gaps where windows should be, covered with thin shutters or cloth. On a windy night, your house doesn't creak. It howls like a sea witch having a tantrum. You don't sleep through storms. You experience them, like immersive theatre with more leaks. But what about castles, you ask? Full of naive optimism. Okay, let's say you're not a peasant. Maybe you're a knight, or a minor noble. Welcome to your stone-cold palace of grandeur. Literally. Castles were built for defense, not comfort. Thick stone walls keep out enemy arrows. Yes, but they also trap in cold like an icebox. They're often damp, mouldy, and echoey. So if someone drops a cup in the Great Hall, you'll hear it 3 floors up, under 6 blankets. Next to your disappointed dog, the only central heating in a castle was a massive fireplace, usually at one end of the Great Hall. Sounds good. But medieval fireplaces had the efficiency of a broken hairdryer. The fire might warm people near it, but further back, you might as well be sitting in a meat locker. There were no chimneys until the 12th century, and even then they were rare, so the smoke just filled the room. You weren't just cold, you were cold and slightly smoked, like a ham with feelings. In peasant homes, the hearth was in the center of the room, and yes, it produced heat, but it also produced soot, ash, and the kind of lung damage that would make a 1940s coal miner say, maybe open a window. Ventilation, that was a hole in the roof. That's it. Just a hole, which means, in winter your heating system doubles as a snow funnel. You wake up, not just to frost on the ground, but inside your house. Cozy. Let's talk floors. If you're imagining wooden planks or stone tiles, stop. Your floor is dirt. Actual. Walk on it, barefoot. Occasionally freezing dirt. Maybe if you're fancy, it's covered in rushes, plant matter thrown down to absorb messes, which is a great plan until you realize nobody changes them for months, and they turn into a mat of filth so nasty, even pigs side-eye it. Now we arrive at one of the worst features of medieval homes, the chamber pot. You think you've had bad roommates? Try sharing a freezing bucket of human waste with your entire family. The pot sat in the corner, politely ignored until someone, usually the youngest or least respected, was ordered to empty it. In winter, though, you had a dilemma. You could take the pot outside, into the snow, in your nightclothes, with no shoes, or you could leave it there to chill like a bottle of wine. Except instead of serving guests, you're just slowly poisoning the air quality, and don't think rich means better bathroom. Even castles used garderobles, a fancy word for a chute in the wall where you did your business and hoped the wind was blowing the right way. In cold months, the seat often froze, so did the contents. Yes, medieval castles had icicles of human tragedy dangling off the side, like the world's worst Christmas decorations. Walls were rarely sealed properly. Gaps in construction let in wind, insects, and the occasional vengeful ghost. Most homes didn't even have ceilings, just rafters. Heat, when it existed, went straight up into the roof, leaving you and your frostbitten toes wondering if warmth was a myth invented by bards. And don't forget the sounds. Houses creaked, groaned and moaned with every breeze. You couldn't tell if it was your home settling or your neighbor dying of hypothermia. Privacy was non-existent. Whole families lived, slept, and argued in a single room. So not only are you freezing, you're doing it while listening to Uncle Edric snore like a dying walrus and your cousin argue with a chicken. So yeah, your house isn't saving you from winter. It's a glorified windbreak that barely keeps your organs from becoming medieval popsicles. If you want to get warm, your best bet is the livestock pen, because at least the pigs are generating body heat, and they don't judge you when you start crying into your frozen shoes. Mealtime in medieval winter, a time of joy, bounty, and comfort, if you're hallucinating. For everyone else, it's a parade of hunger, desperation, and occasionally arguing over who gets the edible part of a boot. The good news, you've got some pickled cabbage. The bad news, so does the rat who lives under your bed, and he's better at sharing. Let's set the scene. It's late December. The fields are dead. The earth is frozen. And your last successful harvest is a distant, misty memory, kind of like happiness. Whatever grains and vegetables you did manage to pull from the ground during the autumn were supposed to last through the winter. Spoiler alert, they don't. That's because medieval food preservation was less science and more gamble. There were no refrigerators, freezers, or helpful expiration dates. Instead, you relied on salting, smoking, drying, or pickling to keep things edible, or at least less deadly. And even those options were limited to people who had enough food in the first place to worry about storing it. If you were poor, and again, you probably were, your preservation method was eat it fast and hope for the best. Salt was precious, like we named the word salary after it to precious, so it wasn't just casually lying around. You might have salted pork, assuming you owned a pig and had something to salt it with, but more likely you were salting root vegetables like turnips, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds. Turnip stew, pickled turnip, turnip paste. Surprise, it's more turnip. It's the medieval version of an all-turnip tasting menu, except none of it tastes like anything. Grain was life. You needed it for bread, porridge, and to not immediately starve to death. But harvests were unpredictable. One bad summer of rain, or worse, a freak frost, and suddenly your food supply was toast. And by toast I mean non-existent, because bread was probably off the menu too. Speaking of bread, medieval loaves were nothing like today's fluffy, Instagrammable bakery dreams. Bread was dense, coarse, and filled with mystery ingredients. Often literally, poor people ate rye or barley bread, sometimes mixed with things like beans, acorns, and sawdust. Yes, sawdust. And if you think that sounds bad, wait until you find out what happens when grain is stored poorly over winter. It molds. But not just any mold. Sometimes it developed ergot, a lovely little fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and occasional death. 1 minute, you're chewing your third crust of despair bread. The next, you're seeing demons dance across your thatched roof. What about meat? Only if you're rich, lucky, or recently robbed a noble with bad aim. The average peasant maybe got meat a few times a year, usually around holidays or festivals. In winter, you might trap a rabbit or ferret, but good luck catching it with frostbitten hands and no shoes. Chickens were more valuable alive, for eggs, and cows. Forget it, a cow is a walking bank account. You don't eat your bank account unless things have gotten very bad. Which brings us to famine. Winter wasn't just cold, it was often the trigger for full-blown hunger crises. The hungry gap refers to the late winter, early spring period, when the stored food is gone, and nothing new has grown yet. Translation: you're watching the calendar like it owes you a meal, and you're starting to eye the family cat a little too longingly. Preserved food, if you had it, was monotonous and gut-wrenching. Pickled cabbage, every day. Cold porridge, sure, a hard chunk of cheese that predates your children. Why not? And don't forget salted fish so dry it could double as a roofing tile. Even nobles got tired of chewing on dried cod that tasted like the sea had regrets. And let's not forget what you drank. Water? Ha! No one drank water. It was full of things that made you dead. Instead, you drank small beer, a very low alcohol brew that even children drank, not for fun, just because it was safer than whatever pond scum you called a well. If the beer froze overnight, you just chiseled off a chunk and hoped it didn't taste like dirt or pig trough. If your luck was especially awful, your winter diet might include things like boiled nettles, tree bark, or ground up animal bones. People literally made soup from bones, and not the fancy kind with marrow and seasoning, just whatever scraps they could boil down for broth. Add in some stale bread soaked in it, and congratulations, you've made medieval prison food. Except you're not in prison, you're at home. Desperate times led to desperate behaviors. Historical records show people stealing from granaries, breaking into monasteries, even resorting to eating dogs, cats, or worse. There are even references to leather soup. Yes, boiling old belts and shoes for something vaguely edible. The good news, no carbs. The bad news, it tastes like depression and foot sweat. And remember, everything you're eating is cold. There's no gas stove, no microwave. If the hearth's not lit, your food is the same temperature as your fingernails, blue. You're not eating dinner, you're enduring it. So to sum up, medieval winter dinner wasn't a cozy family gathering. It was an exercise in endurance, luck, and how many different ways you could chew turnip before going insane. If you weren't dead, you were hungry. If you weren't hungry, someone else was probably eyeing your pickled cabbage like it owed them money. Bon appetit. Congratulations, you've survived not eating dinner and not dying in your icebox of a house. Now let's talk about your outfit, a crucial element of not becoming a historical popsicle. You see, in medieval winter, clothing wasn't just about style, it was about survival. And even then, survival wasn't guaranteed, because while fashion might come and go, hypothermia is forever. Let's start with what you're actually wearing. If you're a regular peasant, aka 90% of the population, and 100% of the cold, your wardrobe is made of two materials, wool and wishful thinking. Wool was your winter MVP. It was warmish, water-resistant-ish, and itchy beyond all mortal comprehension. It's not just slightly scratchy. Wearing medieval wool was like being gently licked by a cactus. Under that wool layer you probably had a linen shirt, because if you wore wool directly on your skin, your screams might wake up the saints. Linen was breathable, lighter, and less likely to make you claw at yourself like you were possessed. The problem? Linen doesn't keep you warm. It's like wrapping yourself in slightly judgmental paper. Now, layering sounds like a good idea, until you remember you probably only owned one of everything. 2 tunics, luxury. 3, witchcraft. Most people didn't have wardrobes. They had a wardrobe, singular. And it was already being patched for the 7th time with pieces from grandma's funeral shroud. Clothes weren't just worn, they were inherited, like trauma and potatoes. Shoes, if you had them, they were leather, and they didn't come with soles that knew the word insulation. They absorbed water faster than gossip in a tavern. Once soaked, they stayed that way until spring, or until your foot developed its own culture of mushrooms. And socks. Hope you enjoy cold feet, because most peasants used woolen wraps or just stuffed their shoes with straw like some sort of depressed scarecrow. Now let's talk outerwear. Coats in the modern sense didn't exist. If it was especially cold, you might wear a cloak, a large rectangle of wool fastened with a brooch. Think of it as a medieval snuggie, except it never stayed closed, offered zero wind protection, and weighed more than your newborn cousin. If you were rich, your cloak might be lined with fur. If you were poor, your cloak might be lined with holes. Speaking of fur, it was the status symbol of warmth. Ermine, squirrel, beaver, fox. You wore what you could trap, trade, or pretend belonged to your cousin. Nobles were often walking menageries in the winter, swanning about in white fur robes like smug snow wizards. The poor, they just looked like the animals the nobles were wearing. Gloves and mittens were rare, and usually handmade. If you had them, they were woolen, and basically just finger prisons that still let the cold in. If not, you tucked your hands inside your sleeves and tried not to cry. Spoiler, you failed. Now picture this. It's snowing. Your roof is leaking. You've just stepped in freezing mud, that seeped through your only pair of shoes. But wait, it gets better. Your clothes are now wet, and nothing dries in medieval winter. Nothing. If it's damp, it stays damp. You can hang it by the fire all you want. That fire is decorative. You're not drying your shirt. You're slow cooking it. Wet wool is the stuff of nightmares. It weighs double, smells like betrayal, and actively saps your will to live. And unlike modern materials, medieval fabrics didn't wick moisture away. They trapped it in like a cursed sponge, ensuring that even when you were dressed, you were still marinating in your own icy despair. And don't think kids got a free pass. Children wore miniature versions of adult clothes. Same wool, same linen, just smaller and somehow even more tragic. Babies were bundled like cabbages in fabric swaddles, then often wrapped in cloaks. But once they learned to walk, junior, into the cold you go. No mittens, no boots, just enthusiasm and chattering teeth. Even fashion laws worked against your warmth. Sumptuary laws dictated what people could wear based on their social rank. That means even if you could afford something warm like rich fur or dyed wool, you might not be allowed to wear it, because God forbid a peasant accidentally survive winter too comfortably. So how did people actually stay warm? They didn't, or they got creative. They huddled together, they shared cloaks, they pressed themselves to livestock, which probably smelled better than their tunics. There are stories of people wearing straw or stuffing their clothes with moss, like human scarecrows, desperate for warmth and dignity. In towns, beggars froze on the streets, wearing threadbare rags. In castles, the wealthy draped themselves in luxury, but even they complained about the chill in their stone walls. Remember, medieval castles weren't cozy. They were stone refrigerators with tapestries. Sure, your cloak is trimmed with mink, but the wind is still blowing through your banquet hall like it has dinner plans. So next time you zip up your goose-down parka or wrap yourself in a fleece blanket, remember, your medieval ancestor didn't have that. They had a lumpy wool tunic, wet feet, and the vague hope that spring would show up before their toes turned black. Let's talk about medieval bathrooms. Oh wait, there weren't any. Welcome to winter in the Middle Ages, where every bodily function becomes a survival challenge, and indoor plumbing is a myth from the future. Forget the luxury of flush toilets. Forget even having four walls around you when nature calls. This isn't just roughing it, this is freezing it, then desperately regretting it. Let's begin with the chamber pot, which sounds elegant until you realize it's just a ceramic bucket you poop in. No seat, no privacy, just you, your shame, and a bowl that silently judges you as you try not to lose your balance in the middle of the night. Because yes, you use it indoors when the weather is too brutal to venture outside. But here's the fun part. It's winter. The inside of your home is barely warmer than the outside, which means your chamber pot. It's an ice trap. The contents freeze. The rim freezes. If you're not careful, you freeze to it. Sitting becomes a gamble with hypothermia. You know how people in the modern world complain about a cold toilet seat? Try perching over a glacial porcelain pot while your toes go numb and your breath fogs like you're in a haunted refrigerator. Now what happens to the contents of this delightful indoor bucket? Someone, spoiler, probably you, has to empty it. Where? Into the cesspit or out the window, depending on your zip code and general interest in public decency. City dwellers might tip it straight into the street with a cheerful cry of Gardyloo. Translation: duck or be baptized in last night's stew. If you live in the countryside, it's off to the outhouse. A rickety wooden shack perched over a hole so deep and terrifying, it may double as a portal to Hades. And here's the best part. It's 50 feet away through mud, snow, and possibly wolf tracks. By the time you get there, half your body has gone numb, and you're questioning every life decision that led you to this moment. Oh, and the outhouse, it's not insulated, it's not even windproof. You sit there, pants around your ankles, praying the wind doesn't find new and creative ways to touch your soul or your delicates. The seat, if it exists, is wooden, and it's about as warm and welcoming as a block of granite in a meat locker. Did we mention frostbite? Because yes, that was absolutely a thing. You haven't known existential dread until you've tried to use an outdoor toilet in January, with nothing but thin wool between your nether regions and an icy breeze that feels personally vindictive. There are accounts of people literally suffering from frostbite on sensitive zones, which historians politely call areas of personal discomfort. The rest of us just say they froze their bits off. And this is all assuming you even make it to the outhouse. Elderly folks, children, or anyone with a bad ankle, they're not trekking through the snow for a poop adventure. They're using the chamber pot, or worse, improvising, corners of rooms, behind the barn. Wherever the wind takes you wasn't just a romantic phrase, it was a survival strategy. Let's pivot to hygiene, because as bad as the toilets were, what came next was arguably worse, trying to clean yourself afterward. Toilet paper? No. You wiped with what was available. Moss, straw, cloth, rags. If you were lucky, your hand, if you were out of options. Then came the part where you were supposed to wash. Except the water was frozen, and so were your fingers. Most people just didn't. You might rinse your hands in icy rainwater or a frozen basin if you were exceptionally determined. But let's be honest, hygiene wasn't winning any battles here. Winter turned everyone into stink bombs with trust issues. For women, things got even more complicated. Menstruation in winter, no sanitary products, no heating, and layers of wool that trapped smells like it was a hobby. Cloth pads were reused after washing in bone-chilling water, but often they were skipped altogether. Some just bled into layers of fabric and hoped no one noticed. Women in winter weren't just surviving, they were doing so while experiencing the medieval version of a horror movie and a laundry nightmare. Castles fared a little better, if you were rich. They had garderobes, essentially toilet chutes built into the castle walls, where your waste dropped into the moat below. Sound hygienic? Think again. The freezing wind could blow up the chute. So yes, rich or poor, you got to play a constant game of what fresh horror is about to touch my bare backside. The smell in winter wasn't any better. Waste froze, yes, but it also piled up. Cesspits filled, chamber pots waited longer to be emptied, and outdoor latrines became icy death traps. You could walk past a home and know exactly what the family ate 2 days ago, and it wasn't a nice surprise. So let's summarize. You're cold, you're outside, you're trying to do your business in a box full of icicles while possibly being watched by a goat. The smell could knock over a Viking, the cleanup is optional, and the dignity, gone, utterly gone. Winter didn't just take your warmth, it stole your last shred of privacy and self-respect. So yes, indoor plumbing is a miracle, central heating is a blessing, but above all, be thankful that your toilet doesn't try to kill you every time you use it. Caught a cold? Better update your will. The village healer thinks rubbing onions on your feet will help. Welcome to winter, in the medieval era, the time of year when the snowflakes fall, the frost bites harder, and your immune system files for resignation. You might think of winter as flu season, but in medieval times it was more like, if you breathe you lose season. The cold didn't just make you uncomfortable, it made you very sick, very fast, and with little hope of getting better, because if the cold didn't get you, the cures probably would. Let's start with the basics. In winter you're cold, constantly. Your feet are always wet, your clothes never fully dry. You sleep in a damp, drafty room that's about the same temperature as a snowman's armpit, and you're breathing in smoke from the fire, because chimneys were still figuring out how to be chimneys. So what do you get from all that? Respiratory problems. So many respiratory problems. Coughing, constant, phlegm, plentiful, lungs, optional. Pneumonia was basically the winter version of a house guest. Shows up uninvited, stays too long, and kills someone before it leaves. And the flu, that wasn't just a few days in bed with soup and Netflix. No, medieval flu could escalate to fever, seizures, and death before you could say bless you. And then there was tuberculosis, also called consumption because that's what it did. Slowly consumed you from the inside out like a very patient demon. You'd start with a little cough, then some blood. Then maybe your teeth started rattling from constant chills. But don't worry. The local medical expert probably blamed it on sin or demonic imbalance. So at least you'd get some spicy judgment along with your inevitable decline. Now you might ask, what about medicine? Didn't they have healers? Yes, unfortunately. Enter the village herbalist, a person whose qualifications included being old, owning dried plants, and possibly having a mole in the shape of a moon. These people were respected, feared, and usually just one suspicious death away from being burned at the stake. Their cures ranged from the mildly ineffective to the did, You just rub goose grease on my chest and call it a blessing. Let's say you've come down with a fever. A proper medieval diagnosis might be something like, your humors are out of balance. Translation: no one knows what's happening, but it involves your body fluids acting rude. Cures included rubbing onions on your feet, because logic, obviously drinking boiled dandelion wine. Which honestly doesn't sound the worst, bloodletting, where they cut you open to let the sickness escape, because nothing says recovery like supervised blood loss in a cold room with a rusty knife. Tying dried toads around your neck, medically questionable, fashionably repulsive. Even more charming was the belief in miasma. The idea that disease was spread by bad air, so people would hang flowers and herbs around the house, or wear little bags of lavender and rosemary under their clothes, like medieval Febreze. If you're dying of bronchitis, don't worry. Someone will wave a burning sage bundle at you until the illness gives up and leaves from sheer awkwardness. And if you got a toothache during winter, that was a whole new circle of frozen hell. Your options were to rub it with garlic, smoke it out with incense, or have it yanked out by someone who owned a pair of pliers and a strong opinion about oral hygiene. Spoiler: no anesthesia, just a strong friend to hold you down, and a prayer that you didn't get lockjaw from the tools. Children were especially vulnerable. No vaccines, no immunity, and absolutely no mercy from the elements. Babies often didn't survive their first few winters. Even a mild cold could turn into whooping cough, scarlet fever, or death by sniffle, because once illness set in, it was a foot race between your body's will to live and the healer's ability to crush dandelions into tea. And if none of those got you, there was always winter dysentery, the stomach bug that made sure you were sprinting to the freezing latrine with every ounce of strength you had left. Nothing like explosive diarrhea and hypothermia to remind you that yes, nature does have a sense of humor, and it's cruel. What made it worse was that people didn't really understand germs. To them, disease came from sin, witches, or sleeping with your windows open. Hygiene was optional at best. Bathing in winter, not happening. So when someone started coughing, the solution wasn't quarantine or chicken soup. It was usually prayer and holding your breath. In cities, it was a buffet of germs, people packed into tight spaces with no ventilation, no sanitation, and no concept of contagious disease. One sick person could start a chain reaction that wiped out half the block before anyone finished boiling their beetroot soup. Even monasteries, with all their discipline and routines, weren't immune to the sniffle apocalypse. So yes, in the medieval winter, you didn't just risk freezing. You risked freezing while wheezing, sneezing, and slowly being cured to death by a man with a stick of sage and too much enthusiasm. If you survived the season without dying, congratulations, you've dodged every biological bullet the century had to offer. Just don't get too cocky. Spring brings back the plague. Now when it comes to nightfall, it is basically the end of the world. Once the sun sets, it's just you, the dark, and the sound of something definitely not friendly outside. Imagine this: you've somehow survived the bone-snapping cold all day. Your fingers only mildly resemble popsicles, and you've dodged illness, starvation, and hypothermic trips to the outhouse. You limp back to your hut, your hovel, your drafty log box of dreams, and then the sun goes down, and that's when things get really bad. In the medieval world, nightfall wasn't just the end of the day. It was the beginning of a survival horror game, where the only controller is a stub of wax and a prayer. Let's start with lighting. In our modern lives, dark means dim mood lighting, and maybe a flickering phone screen. In the medieval countryside, dark means black hole with bonus howling. There are no street lamps, no flashlights, no electricity. Your best hope is a candle made of tallow, i.e. rendered animal fat that smells like despair, or an oil lamp that threatens to burn your house down if you even look at it sideways. You might think, why not keep a fire going? Great idea, if you enjoy the thrill of possibly dying from carbon monoxide poisoning, because chimneys back then were more like hope vents. Smoke filled the room, and you had to lie down below the layer of asphyxiation if you wanted to survive the night without turning into medieval jerky. But even if you managed your little flickering flame of safety, it didn't do much. The walls were still thin. The windows were just holes with maybe a cloth nailed over them. And the night was full of things you couldn't see, but definitely could hear. Because the medieval night, it was alive. Let's talk wildlife. Wolves were not Disney sidekicks. They were real, hungry, and completely uninterested in your personal growth arc. If you lived near the forest, and odds are you did, you probably had nights when you heard them howling, or closer, scratching, or worse, not hearing them at all until you woke up to find one sniffing around your fire pit, like it owned the place. And wolves were just the tip of the fanged iceberg. Foxes, wild dogs, bears, yes, bears, who didn't always get the hibernation memo, lurked in the shadows. If you lived in Eastern Europe, congratulations. You also got lynxes, boars, and sometimes things with way too many glowing eyes, and not enough fear of humans. If nature didn't get you, your fellow humans just might. Darkness was a criminal's best friend. Medieval villages didn't have police. If you were lucky, there was a night watchman, aka the oldest guy in the village with one working eye and a torch that kept going out. So thieves, highwaymen, and the occasional desperate peasant would use the night to rob travelers, break into homes, or settle long-standing grudges with a rusty pitchfork. If someone wanted to disappear into the night, they didn't need GPS, they just needed a cloudy sky and the knowledge that no one could see anything after sunset. And speaking of disappearing, let's not forget fire. It giveth light, but it also taketh away everything you love, usually in less than 10 minutes. Medieval buildings were made of wood, thatch, and wishful thinking. A single spark could level a village. That's why many towns had strict laws about dousing fires by a certain hour, which is adorable, because then you're left to face the wolves, criminals, and your inner existential dread, with nothing but the moonlight and your itchy blanket of doom. But wait, there's more. You know what else Nightfall brought? Paranoia. The medieval world was soaked in superstition. With darkness came all manner of imagined terrors. People believed the night air itself was dangerous, full of evil spirits, demons or malevolent fairies looking for your unattended children. If you heard a weird noise outside, better grab the holy water and recite a prayer, because odds were someone thought it was a sign of witchcraft, a ghost, or a cursed chicken. Night wasn't just a time, it was a realm, a separate, shadowy world where your daily routine could be interrupted by a spectral horseman or a cursed monk. This is why many people refused to travel after dark, even if it meant camping next to a rotting fence post in the middle of nowhere, because at least it wasn't possessed. So what did people do at night? Mostly, they didn't. You went to bed early, because light was expensive, and staying awake only increased your odds of becoming a bedtime statistic. Families slept in one room, sometimes in one bed, layered like sad, shivering lasagna. You hoped no one rolled into the fire pit, no rats joined the cuddle pile, and that the creaking sound wasn't the roof deciding it was tired of existing. And on those long, long nights, where 16 hours of darkness stretched endlessly between dusk and dawn, you lay awake and listened to the wolves, the wind, the suspicious knocking, the occasional scream from somewhere in the woods. Maybe it was an animal, maybe not. All you knew was that once the sun was gone, you weren't safe anymore. So yes, in medieval winter, Nightfall didn't gently close the day. It slammed the door, locked it, and tossed the key into a haunted pond. Let's get one thing straight. Just because it's freezing, and you woke up with your blanket frozen to your eyebrows, doesn't mean you get the day off. In medieval times, winter didn't mean holiday cheer or cozy working from home days. It meant you got to experience all the fun of frostbite, with none of the modern convenience of soup or sympathy. Because guess what? The goats are still alive, and tragically, so are you. Let's start with one of the cruelest truths of the medieval peasant experience. The animals don't hibernate. Cows, pigs, goats, chickens, they all still need food, water, and clean bedding. And none of them care that it's -7 degrees and your boots are made of hope and some suspiciously crunchy leather. Tending livestock meant hauling buckets of water across a snowy yard, breaking through sheets of ice on the troughs, and spooning hay into stalls while your fingers slowly turned into flesh-coloured icicles. You know that satisfying modern feeling of putting on warm gloves before shoveling snow? Yeah. Now replace those with wool mittens that got wet 3 days ago and have since transformed into frozen sleeves of doom. And if you thought your animals might provide a little warmth, you're only half right. They do give off body heat, but they also give off kicks, bites, and loud opinions at 5 a.m. Good luck milking a cow when the temperature is low enough to freeze your bucket mid-squat. Congratulations, you've just created udder-flavoured ice sculpture. Of course, Livestock wasn't your only concern. You also needed firewood, lots of it. Because if you ran out, the house didn't just get chilly, it turned into a medieval meat locker, featuring you as the ham. So you'd be out chopping wood in the snow, armed with a dull axe and the muscular tone of someone who ate thin porridge for breakfast. And cutting firewood wasn't just exhausting, it was dangerous. The axe could slip, the logs could roll, and if you dropped something, say goodbye, because you were not bending over in that snow, unless you had a spare spine. Blisters? Check. Splinters? Check. Existential despair at 11:15 in the morning? Absolutely. Let's not forget, hauling water. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of plumbing, so every drop of water used for drinking, cooking, or not dying had to be carried from a well, river, or nearby stream. In summer, this was annoying. In winter, it was a death-defying obstacle course, featuring icy paths, freezing water, and the exciting chance of falling in and emerging as a cautionary tale. You might think a spilled bucket just means start again. In the Middle Ages, it also meant frozen socks, wet clothes, and the thrilling possibility of turning into a local legend called That One Guy Who Froze Solid with a Pail. And while we're talking about hauling things, let's not forget, you are the machine. There are no wagons rolling smoothly over snowdrifts. There are no wheelbarrows unless you made one yourself. So when something heavy needs to be moved, whether it's sacks of grain, bundles of wood, or your uncle who passed out in the cold, you're the ox. You drag it. You curse it. You maybe cry a little, then you keep dragging it. And don't get too excited about the work ending at some point. Winter days may be short, but the to-do list is long and completely indifferent to your level of frostbite. There's mending to do, tools to fix, roofs to patch, fences to reinforce, and a constant low-level panic about whether you stored enough supplies before the first snow fell. Because if you didn't, you'll find out the hard way. Spoiler, the hard way involves digging through frozen ground with a stick, because the pig pen collapsed, and now your last source of bacon is running feral toward the woods. And here's the really fun twist. Winter labor wasn't just about physical exhaustion, it was psychological. Every task carried with it the knowledge that failure wasn't just inconvenient, it was fatal. If you didn't chop enough wood, someone in your family might not make it through the week. If you didn't get to the well, you might all run out of water. If you didn't fix that hole in the barn roof, the sheep might freeze, and there goes your wool and next year's rent. The stakes were always high, and the margin for error buried somewhere under the snow next to last year's bad decisions. Meanwhile, if you lived in a town, things weren't much better. Winter jobs included scraping ice off walkways, shoveling snow with a board nailed to a stick, and carrying messages between people who should absolutely have written a letter instead. And since you were doing it all without snow boots, snow pants, or anything remotely waterproof, your entire lower body basically turned into a damp, numb regret sponge by mid-afternoon. Oh, and if you were one of the lucky few with a craft or trade, blacksmith, cooper, weaver, guess what? You still had to work, too. And since your hands didn't come with heated glove settings, every task was a balancing act between productivity and the slow descent into frosty-fingered madness. So no, winter wasn't a time for rest. It wasn't quiet, or peaceful, or magical. It was a constant, exhausting, freezing reminder that nature is in charge, and you are a very tired, meat popsicle with responsibilities. Sleep tight. You've got 6 more weeks of snow chores. If you think winter in the Middle Ages was all hard labor and frostbitten toes, you'd be mostly right. But there was also the long, slow, soul-numbing void of nothing to do. Because once the chores were done, and the fire was lit, barely, you were left with the most terrifying thing of all, your thoughts and your family. At the same time, let's set the scene. It's January. The wind is howling outside like a wolf auditioning for opera. You're inside a one-room cottage, the size of a modern walk-in closet. It's packed with people who haven't bathed in 3 weeks, animals who never asked to be here, and a distinct smell of wet wool and despair. What do you do for fun? Well, first off, let's manage your expectations. There's no chess unless someone carved the pieces, no books unless you live in a monastery, and no privacy unless you crawl under a pile of straw and pretend to be a particularly antisocial dog. Your main entertainment options fall into 4 categories: storytelling, music, staring at the fire like it owes you money, and mentally preparing to throttle Uncle Edgar if he tells the once I saw a fish this big story one more time. Before movies, before TikTok, before Real Housewives of 14th century Kent, there were stories. And if you were lucky, someone in your household was good at telling them. If not, well, enjoy the 47th retelling of how Grandpa got a pimple that looked like a demon. Folk tales, local legends, and wildly exaggerated personal experiences made up the programming slate. Ghost stories were big in winter, because clearly, the icy darkness wasn't unsettling enough. So were morality tales, which usually ended with someone getting eaten, cursed, or married to a goat by mistake because they didn't listen to their parents. Of course, once you heard the same story 36 times, you started wishing the ghost would just show up and drag you away for some variety. If your family had a lute, a fiddle or a bagpipe, and a questionable sense of peace and quiet, then congratulations, you had music. But don't expect a medieval Beyoncé. Music in winter was often the same few tunes played over and over until your brain could hum them in your sleep, and someone was always slightly off-key. Bonus points if your cousin only knew the chorus and insisted on repeating it until your sanity froze solid. Lyrics, mostly about lost love, dead sheep, or tragic bread shortages. If it had a rhythm and could be clapped to, it was a hit. And because you probably couldn't afford parchment, much less sheet music, the lyrics changed every time, leading to glorious nonsense like, "O fair maid of Yorkshire, your eyes are like stew, and your boots smell of cabbage, but I still fancy you." Platinum record? No, but it killed 20 minutes, and that's all that mattered. Sometimes the best entertainment was simply zoning out in front of a fire like a medieval lava lamp. If you've ever gotten lost in the hypnotic dance of flames, imagine doing that for 6 hours straight, because it's either that or making eye contact with your cousin who once ate a candle on a dare. The fire was the family TV. It gave warmth, light, and something to look at that didn't complain, snore, or play offbeat tambourine. Kids would poke it with sticks. Adults would try to judge the weather based on the color of the smoke. Grandma might tell you it whispers your destiny. It didn't, of course. It mostly whispered, "You should have stored more firewood." Still, fire watching beat the alternative. Cold, dark silence, and the growing suspicion that your neighbor was plotting to borrow your last candle again. Ever wondered what happens when 8 people live in 150 square feet for 3 straight months with nothing to do? Congratulations, you've just invented cabin fever, centuries ahead of schedule. Tensions rose, arguments broke out. Someone always chewed too loudly, or took up too much space on the communal hay pile. Children were inventing games like Don't Touch the Chicken and Guess Which Family Member Farted, which honestly didn't help. At some point, a chicken would escape into the corner, and everyone would spend 15 thrilling minutes trying to catch it without tipping over the pot of slightly warm cabbage water. That counted as excitement. It wasn't all gloom, though. These cramped conditions sometimes produced moments of genuine bonding. Families told jokes, bad ones, made up songs, and carved little figurines from bone or wood. Crafts were a thing, but remember, no Pinterest. You were using tools that could double as weapons, working by firelight, and hoping your whittled spoon didn't look like a cursed goblin. So yes, medieval winter entertainment was less Netflix binge, more mentally surviving while sitting in damp socks, listening to your brother practice the same lute solo for 4 hours. The real achievement wasn't beating boredom, it was not burying someone in a snowbank out of sheer frustration. And when the sun finally peeked out in spring, and you could escape your human sardine can, the world never looked brighter or quieter. If you survived the medieval winter, congratulations, you've unlocked the not dead yet achievement. In the Middle Ages, winter wasn't a time of mulled wine, cozy socks, and snowflake-shaped cookies. No, winter was nature's way of asking, are you still sure you want to be alive? Because surviving a medieval winter wasn't guaranteed. It was a low-odds, high-difficulty game mode, where the tutorial was hope you don't die, and the reward for winning was, you guessed it, more work. That's assuming you didn't become a sad little frost statue behind your cottage first. Death in medieval winter was basically a seasonal activity, like skiing but with more starvation and fewer lift passes. Every December, the Grim Reaper dusted off his calendar and cleared his schedule. Cold weather meant a surge in deaths across all age groups, and especially among the weakest members of society. Infants, the elderly, and anyone who thought they could warm up by standing near a candle. Some didn't make it past the first cold snap. Others made it until February, then dropped off like overripe turnips, and not from dramatic causes either. Often it was just life failure. Your body ran out of heat, your immune system ran out of luck, and your family ran out of ways to keep you alive. This wasn't an era where doctors rushed to your bedside. This was an era where people said, "He looks a little pale," and then started digging a hole just in case. Let's talk about babies. Specifically, how many of them didn't survive their first winter? The short answer, a lot. The long answer, a depressingly high number that would make modern pediatricians spontaneously combust. Newborns had paper-thin chances. If a baby was born during the warmer months, parents still held their breath until spring came again. Because winter was coming, and babies were basically helpless bags of cold-sensitive organs. They didn't have fleece onesies or temperature-controlled rooms. They had maybe a swaddling cloth, a spot near the fire, and the raw, desperate hope that the household goat would snuggle close. Parents sometimes waited weeks before naming a child, because forming an emotional attachment to someone who might not survive their first Christmas was considered bad planning. By January, the food situation was often less meals and more vague memories of meals. If your harvest in autumn had been poor, and spoiler alert, it usually was, your winter pantry looked like the back of a sad medieval fridge. A few roots, some salted fish, bread that had a beard before you did. Rations got smaller every week. Families had to decide whether to eat now and risk starving later, or save food and starve slower. And starvation didn't just mean hunger, it meant weakness, cold bones, sluggish thoughts, a body unable to fight off even the smallest infection, or survive a chilly night without breaking down like an old cart. When food ran out completely, people ate bark, leather, shoe soles. If it wasn't nailed down and didn't scream when you bit it, it was fair game. Some communities even faced the horrors of cannibalism. Not common, but not unheard of either. A neighbor going missing in February was more suspicious than usual. Exposure killed more than people realized. You didn't have to be naked in a snowstorm to die of cold. Just being a little too cold for a little too long could shut your body down like a medieval Windows 95. You could freeze to death while fetching water, while feeding animals, while trying to take a chamber pot outside, and worst of all, while asleep. Entire families would huddle in one bed, dogs and livestock included, just to survive the night. It wasn't cozy, it was an act of pure biological defiance. Going outside meant taking your life in your hands. Staying inside meant hoping your walls didn't leak wind, and that your fire didn't burn out. Either way, your survival depended on a very unstable cocktail of firewood, body heat, and dumb luck. If you made it to spring, you weren't just alive, you were reborn. The ice melted, and so did the tension. The sun came back, and you finally saw your own fingers, without them looking like frozen sausages. The birds returned. Grass turned green. You could smell something other than smoke and wet fur. People emerged from their homes like moles blinking at the light, looking like they had aged 5 years since October. They cleaned graves. They planted food. They buried what was left of the salted fish and the salted optimism, and they quietly thanked the heavens that they weren't part of the winter death tally. There were no parties, no fireworks, just relief. The kind that comes from surviving a natural disaster one slow, grueling day at a time. So surviving a medieval winter, that wasn't a seasonal accomplishment. That was a life milestone, like graduating from Frostbite University with a minor in suffering. You didn't celebrate with cake, you celebrated by being not dead and immediately going back to work, so you wouldn't die next winter. And if you lived long enough, you'd repeat the cycle all over again. Congratulations, survivor. You've earned your peasant badge. Just don't lose it next November. Before Marie Antoinette became the most misunderstood dessert enthusiast in European history, she was just Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, a name that takes longer to say than her actual reign as Queen of France. Born on November 2nd, 1755, in Vienna, she was the 15th child, yes, 15th of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Emperor Francis I. If you're wondering how parenting works when you've got 15 kids, the answer is, it doesn't. You get tutors, titles, and a whole lot of formality. and possibly forget a name or two along the way. Despite being born into the glittering Habsburg dynasty, a family tree with more branches intertwining than a plate of spaghetti, Maria Antonia's early life was less golden tiara, more educational trauma. You see, her mother, Maria Theresa, wasn't just a monarch. She was a multitasking machine who ran a massive empire, micromanaged her children's futures, and wrote more letters than an entire season of Bridgerton. Enlightened in theory, terrifying in practice. Now, Enlightenment parenting sounds progressive, right? Think again. It meant you got drilled in religion, obedience, statecraft, and how to curtsy without wobbling. You know, the basics. Maria Theresa had a plan for every one of her children like she was building a geopolitical IKEA shelf. One daughter gets sent to Naples, one to Parma, and little Maria Antonia, France. The crown jewel of alliances, the pièce de résistance, the diplomatic equivalent of don't mess this up. Problem was, and this is where things get delightfully awkward, Maria Antonia wasn't exactly queen material trademark yet. Her French was, well, let's call it aspirational. And while she could play the harpsichord, and had a face that practically glowed with royal photogenic potential, her tutors complained that she wasn't great at reading, spelling, or really anything that required prolonged attention. One instructor noted she had a difficult memory, which is polite 18th century speak, for we're not sure if she's daydreaming or genuinely doesn't care. When you're a teenage archduchess more interested in dancing than declensions, grammar tends to take a back seat. Fluent in French? Not quite, but fluent in spending, getting there. Her education may have been shaky, but Maria Antonia excelled in one very important area, being charming. People liked her. She had big girl next door who just happens to be royalty. Energy. She danced well, smiled often, and had an intuitive grasp of how to act royal without looking robotic. That kind of charisma would later work for, and against her in France. Now it's worth pausing for a second to admire just how aggressively strategic Maria Theresa was in her matchmaking. This was a woman who treated marriage like global chess, and if her daughter didn't know how to play, that was fine, she'd be the pawn. The Austrian-French alliance was fragile, and marrying little Antonia, off to the heir of the French throne, was supposed to be a masterstroke of diplomacy. Peace in Europe, wrapped up in a teenage girl with carefully powdered hair. So, at age 14, with minimal notice and zero understanding of what awaited her, Maria Antonia packed her bags, left her beloved home, and reportedly her dog, which honestly might have been the cruelest part, and embarked on the most terrifying journey of her life. Marriage to someone she'd never met, in a country where she barely spoke the language, with a nation watching her like a hawk in a powdered wig. Her farewell ceremony involved a bizarre tradition called Le Remi, which essentially meant stripping her of all Austrian belongings, literally everything, before stepping onto French soil. New clothes, new language, new identity. She wasn't Maria Antonia anymore. She was Marie Antoinette. Now, France's future queen, PR disaster in waiting, and the unlucky teenager about to become the face of an empire already cracking at the seams. What's wild is that no one expected her to rule. Her job was to look good doing nothing important, while producing lots of babies and smiling politely at powdered old men. That was the plan. The plan didn't survive contact with history. So to recap, born into royalty, raised in a palace with a mother who ran Europe like a tightly wound spreadsheet, sent off to be married at 14 to secure a fragile peace between Austria and France, and expected to charm an entire nation on command, with limited training, shaky grades, and an accent that made Parisian courtiers twitch. No pressure, right? And thus begins the saga of Marie Antoinette, a teenager with great cheekbones, middling French, and a one-way ticket to becoming the most fashionable scapegoat in European history. The stage is set, the wigs are fluffed, and the guillotine is, well, not quite on the horizon yet. But give it time. Being 14 is awkward enough when you're just trying to survive middle school. Now imagine being 14, in a giant hooped dress, standing in front of the entire French court, and being told, congratulations, you're now married to a boy you've never met. Time to save 2 empires. And by the way, everyone will be watching when you go to bed. Welcome to Marie Antoinette's honeymoon phase. Zero spark, maximum pressure. The year was 1770, and the newly renamed Marie Antoinette was shipped off to Versailles to marry Louis Auguste. The awkward, bashful, and probably constipated heir to the French throne. He was 15, she was 14. Their collective social experience could fit in a powdered wig box with room to spare. To say there was no chemistry between them is putting it generously. The royal couple had all the chemistry of a soggy croton is honestly an insult to crotons. Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, was more interested in locksmithing, hunting, and avoiding eye contact than in, well, doing what married royals are supposed to do. And Marie? She had just left her childhood, her country, and her freedom behind. Now she was being asked to perform under palace-sized pressure, with a boy who treated her like a diplomatic package deal. And this wasn't just awkward teen marriage. Awkward. This was Versailles awkward, where everything was public, performative, and painfully scrutinized. Most infamously, the night of the wedding included a bizarre tradition called the bedding ceremony, which sounds like a reality TV challenge, but was, in fact, a very real thing. After the lavish wedding celebration, the royal couple was escorted to their bed by courtiers, bishops, and other professional buzzkills, who watched them climb in together. The Archbishop of Reims even blessed the bed. Romantic? Not quite. Imagine trying to feel flirty while your in-laws are standing at the foot of your bed with candles. And what followed that night? Absolutely nothing. For 7 years, yes, 7 entire years passed before Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI consummated their marriage. That's longer than most streaming services have existed. During that time, Europe whispered, Versailles gossiped, and Marie's reputation took hit after hit. Because here's the thing in royal circles, your actual job isn't just to wear crowns and attend banquets, it's to make babies, preferably male ones, and quickly. The lack of royal offspring turned into a national emergency, one solved, tragically, by absolutely everyone deciding it must be Marie's fault. Never mind the fact that Louis might have had a medical condition. There's a popular theory that he suffered from phimosis, a condition requiring a minor surgery to, let's just say, unlock the royal hardware. But whether that's true or just 18th century medical gossip, the pressure was crushing. Marie Antoinette was accused of being frigid, barren, unfeminine, too feminine, or just generally bad at being queen, while Louis went back to playing with his locks. Literally, he loved locks. While his wife was suffering humiliation, he was tinkering with keyholes. Meanwhile, the court at Versailles buzzed like a beehive full of powdered wigs and passive-aggressive compliments. Courtiers analyzed the royal couple's behavior like it was an Olympic sport. Did they walk side by side? Did they make eye contact? Was Marie smiling too much? Not enough? Was Louis avoiding her? Were her dresses too elaborate? Not elaborate enough? Every dinner, every glance, every missed dance became fuel for the rumor machine. Even worse, Marie was stuck in a vicious cycle of public expectation and private rejection. She was constantly paraded before the court, expected to look beautiful, charming, and perfectly royal, while privately being ignored by the one person she actually needed to impress her husband. It was like living in a reality show where you lose points every time your husband chooses woodworking over you. In response, Marie Antoinette did what any frustrated teenager trapped in a diamond cage might do. She leaned into escapism. But that's a story for another chapter. Here, in these early years, she was still trying, writing affectionate letters to her mother, smiling through the court rituals, putting on the perfect performance, while quietly unraveling inside. She was a girl pretending to be a queen, married to a boy pretending to be a husband, surrounded by people pretending to be loyal. The royal bedroom remained cold, but the political stakes were hot. This wasn't just about awkward teenage romance, it was about alliances. If the marriage failed, the Austrian-French diplomatic bond could fray. If Marie didn't produce an heir, her value as queen could be questioned. Her worth, in the eyes of the court, was being reduced to a womb that wouldn't cooperate. And here's the twist that makes it all even more tragicomic. When Louis finally did get it together, possibly post-surgery, though historians still debate that, it was basically announced like breaking news. One ambassador joyfully wrote, "The marriage has been consummated," as if the French weather forecast had just turned sunny. So in summary, Marie Antoinette entered her marriage a hopeful teenager, endured a deeply humiliating court culture that turned her personal life into public sport, and spent her early years in Versailles being blamed for problems that weren't hers to fix. It was a rough honeymoon. And frankly, the honeymoon never really ended. It just got replaced by politics, partying, and eventually, pitchforks. But we're not there yet. If you ever feel like your job has weird expectations, consider this. Marie Antoinette couldn't sneeze without it becoming a political statement. Welcome to Versailles, the glittering fever dream of royal performance, where reality was optional but appearances were mandatory, and where a queen's entire life was a stage play, with powdered wigs, gold trim, and more side eyes than a high school cafeteria. The Palace of Versailles wasn't just a home. It was a choreographed spectacle of monarchy, a grand architectural mic drop from Louis the original Sun King, who decided, what if my house was so fancy it made nobles forget they had rights? By the time Marie Antoinette arrived, Versailles had become the world's most expensive game of pretend. Reality was draped in silk. Reality checks were strictly forbidden. So what did life look like for the young queen in this glitter-drenched court? Let's start with getting dressed. For Marie Antoinette, changing clothes was less of a personal activity and more of a team sport. The lever, or royal rising, was a daily ritual in which noble women attended her morning dressing session like it was an audience with Beyoncé, who got to hand her the camise. That depended on your rank. Yes, a literal pecking order determined who got to pass the underpants. God help you if you handed the queen her gloves out of turn. You might accidentally launch a court scandal and a minor war. This wasn't just tradition, it was political theatre. Every gesture at Versailles had layers of meaning. Every ribbon, every hair accessory, every tilt of the fan. It all meant something. The court was a hive of subtle signalling, where noble families vied for influence by staying close to the queen, flattering her, and ideally, touching her elbow with permission. Think of it as 18th century influencer culture, but with more chandeliers and fewer ring lights. And Marie, she quickly discovered that being queen meant becoming a living symbol. People weren't looking at her for her thoughts. Spoiler, no one wanted her opinions. They were looking at her image. Her image was her currency. So what did she do? She leaned in. Marie Antoinette became a fashion icon, long before the internet existed, to stan her for it. She turned Versailles into a runway, launching trends so rapidly that Parisian dressmakers were barely able to keep up. If she wore a towering hairstyle with a miniature battleship in it, yes, that happened. Suddenly everyone wanted to look like a floating armada. If she posed in a soft muslin gown like a milkmaid, society women immediately scrambled to imitate that casual peasant aesthetic, minus the actual peasantry. She even had a personal dressmaker, Rose Bertin, who became something of a celebrity herself. Together, they invented what you might call royal branding. Marie Antoinette didn't just wear clothes, she broadcasted status, taste, and rebellion, not with words, but with silk, lace, and the occasional 10-foot-wide hoop skirt. She was the original fashion-forward rebel, except, instead of annoying your parents, she accidentally infuriated an entire nation. Of course, Versailles, being Versailles, the more fabulous she looked, the more knives she felt in her back, metaphorically at first. The nobility loved her style when it was convenient, but many resented her extravagance, mocked her foreign tastes, and whispered constantly about her choices. Did she spend too much? Was she too independent? Too stylish? Too aloof? The answer was always yes, no matter what she did. And then came the portraits. Being queen meant being painted constantly, and each portrait was a PR landmine. When Marie commissioned a now famous painting of herself in a simple cotton dress, meant to show her as natural, relatable, just like the people, the public didn't coo in admiration. They freaked out. Cotton? Too informal, too revealing, too not Versailles. How dare the queen look like a commoner, while her subjects couldn't even afford bread? More on that later. In short, Marie Antoinette lived under a microscope, a very expensive, bejeweled microscope operated by aristocrats with a taste for sabotage. She was expected to be dignified but charming, beautiful but modest, fashionable but not frivolous, visible but not overexposed, influential but silent. She couldn't win, because the game was rigged. Versailles demanded that she sparkle without ever sweating, and then punished her for looking like she enjoyed it. Worse, every wardrobe choice, every social outing, every sponsored embroidery project became fodder for gossip pamphlets, known as libels. These weren't just tabloids, they were political weapons. They accused her of everything from bankrupting France to sleeping with half the court, including her own brother-in-law, to secretly being a man, and most people believed them, because Versailles looked like a fantasy, and in fantasy, queens are either fairy tale heroines or villains. Guess which one Marie became? By the end of her first few years in Versailles, Marie Antoinette was no longer just the teenage bride of Louis XVI. She was a cultural lightning rod, beloved by some, resented by many, and always on display. Whether she was changing dresses, attending operas, or simply standing still, she was performing. And performance, as we'll see, is exhausting, especially when the audience starts sharpening their pitchforks. By the 1780s, Marie Antoinette wasn't just the Queen of France. She was the walking, talking embodiment of treat-yourself culture. Centuries before Instagram influencers made it fashionable to blow a month's rent on scented candles and macarons. But while her palace wardrobe could have dressed an army of mannequins and her lifestyle made Versailles look like a clearance aisle, the French public was not amused. Turns out, when half your country can't afford bread, diamond hairpins become a political liability. Let's start with Marie's favourite escape hatch, the Petit Trianon, a charming little palace tucked away in the gardens of Versailles. Think of it as her very own royal Barbie dream house, minus the plastic, plus real gold leaf. Louis XVI gifted it to her as a retreat, a place where she could flee the suffocating formality of court life, and flee she did. The Petit Trianon became her personal escape room, where only her closest friends and confidants were welcome. No powdered wig politicians, no elbow-grabbing nobles, and definitely no angry commoners. But her escape came with aesthetic consequences. Inside the Petit Trianon, Marie styled herself not as a queen, but as a kind of idealized peasant girl, albeit a peasant girl wearing silk slippers and managing a private farm staffed by actual peasants. She even commissioned an entire fake village, the Hameau de la Reine, complete with milkmaids, cows and cheese wheels, arranged just so. It was cosplay for the aristocracy. Look at me, I'm living the simple life, as long as someone else churns the butter. And don't even get us started on the fashion. Marie Antoinette didn't follow trends, she created them. She had an entire economy orbiting her hemline, including tailors, milliners, perfumers, and wig architects. Yes, architects, because her hairstyles occasionally rivaled apartment buildings in height. At one point, she popularized a towering hairdo called the puff, which doubled as a weather vane, a news headline, and a general health hazard if you walked near a chandelier. One such puff was themed after a naval battle, complete with a miniature ship bobbing atop her curls. Another showcased fruit, feathers, and an entire garden's worth of flora. Imagine spending 3 hours getting ready in the morning just to look like an 18th century diorama. Stylish? Absolutely. Subtle? Not even close. Then there were the shoes. Marie had a shoe collection that would make even modern fashionistas reconsider their life choices. Embroidered satin, gilded heels, jewel-encrusted slippers. Her feet were never caught dead in anything under 500 francs. Rumor has it, she once changed outfits 3 times in a single evening, just to match her shoes to her gambling tables. Ah yes, gambling. Marie's love of cards was legendary. While she wasn't much interested in statecraft or tax reform, she could sit at the card table until sunrise, sipping wine and casually losing enough money to finance a small war. At one point, her debts from gambling and parties reached levels that could have bought several dozen peasant villages and possibly a revolution postponement plan. And the parties? Versailles under Marie was lit, literally. Masquerade balls, midnight operas, lavish banquets, and musical performances became weekly events. Attendees dressed in elaborate costumes, masks, and enough perfume to stun a horse. Marie loved nothing more than throwing a glittery distraction from reality, even as that reality began sharpening its pitchforks. But here's where it all started to go very, very wrong. While Marie Antoinette was playing milkmaid in diamond-studded slippers, France was going broke. The country had just spent a massive fortune supporting the American Revolution. You're welcome, America, and decades of mismanagement had drained the royal coffers. The result? Bread prices skyrocketed, unemployment soared, and the people got hangry. Not a great mood when guillotines exist. Meanwhile, Marie's public image was absolutely tanking. Pamphlets portrayed her as a frivolous foreign spendthrift who cared more about her wigs than her people. She was dubbed Madame Deficit, not exactly a nickname that screams national approval. Her Austrian origins didn't help either. To many, she was the outsider queen who came to France, partied too hard, and helped flush the economy down the gold-encrusted toilet. And here's the tragic irony. Marie Antoinette wasn't in charge of the national budget. She didn't start wars or write tax codes. Her spending was excessive, sure, but the real financial problems ran deeper: corruption, structural inequality, and economic collapse. Still, in a time without social media managers, she made a perfect scapegoat. Easier to blame the woman in the feathered dress than the decades of royal mismanagement. By the mid-1780s, Marie Antoinette had become a walking contradiction. She was worshipped for her style, then mocked for her extravagance. She was hated for ignoring the people, then criticized when she tried to act relatable. No matter what she did, she couldn't win. But as we'll see, the real scandal hadn't even hit yet. All this luxury, all this drama, it was just the prequel, because coming soon to a courtroom near you, a diamond necklace, a criminal con, and the PR disaster that would make Madame Deficit look like a compliment. Ah yes, the four most famous words Marie Antoinette never actually uttered. Let them eat cake. A phrase so legendary. It's basically the historical equivalent of getting cancelled over a tweet you didn't even write. The irony? There's no record, none of her ever saying it, no diary entry, no royal speech, no transcript from the Versailles bake-off. And yet, this fictional frosting-covered soundbite became the cherry on top of her public image as a clueless, out-of-touch monarch with about as much awareness of poverty as a soufflé has street smarts. Let's break it down. The original French version of the quote is "Quils mangent de la brioche," which technically translates to "let them eat brioche," a kind of rich, eggy bread you bake when your bread wants to cosplay as cake. And while that does sound delicious, it's hardly a solution to mass starvation. But here's the kicker. This line predates Marie Antoinette by decades. It first appeared in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765, when Marie was still a toddler back in Austria, struggling with her French vowels and figuring out which spoon was for dessert. Rousseau attributes the quote not to a queen, but to a great princess. That's it. No name, no location, just vague pastry shaming. So how did this line get pinned to Marie Antoinette's elegantly powdered head? Propaganda, baby. And not the subtle kind. We're talking full-blown revolutionary smear campaign, with all the nuance of a flaming guillotine poster. In the late 1780s, France was simmering in debt, poverty, and discontent. Food prices were skyrocketing, wages were flatlining, and the national mood was somewhere between mildly cranky and burn it all down. Naturally, the public wanted a villain, and if you were looking for someone who embodied decadence, foreignness, and fabulous wardrobe choices, Marie Antoinette practically volunteered. Enter the pamphlets, cheap, widely circulated, and deliciously venomous. Think of them as 18th century tabloids meets Reddit conspiracy threads, complete with salacious drawings, exaggerated quotes, and scathing critiques. Marie was depicted as everything from a sex-crazed libertine to a plague on France's economy, even when the real problem was decades of mismanagement and fiscal fumbling by generations of monarchs. But why bother with nuance when you can draw the queen riding a donkey backward, throwing gold coins into a burning oven? And so, somewhere in the soup of slander, satire, and political rage, that Rousseau quote found its new home. Let them eat cake was the perfect poison. Short, sharp, and so deliciously outrageous that no one stopped to check the source. Suddenly, it was fact. Schoolchildren were told she said it. Revolutionaries scrawled it on protest banners. Foreign newspapers printed it as gospel truth. It was the 18th century version of going viral, and Marie Antoinette was the unwilling meme. The real Marie Antoinette, by the way, was not entirely clueless. She knew the country was in trouble. By the late 1780s, she had tried, albeit awkwardly, to become more involved in politics. She encouraged her husband to reform taxes unpopular, cut spending laughably late, and even supported some progressive ministers who were promptly fired. But none of that mattered. The cake quote had done its damage. Because in an era where 98% of the population was struggling to afford bread, the mere suggestion that their queen thought brioche was a viable plan B was enough to light a match. The quote didn't just paint her as indifferent, it turned her into a symbol of elite cruelty. Never mind that it was fictional. It felt true, and in politics, perception often is reality, especially when the mobs are sharpening pitchforks, and your palace has more mirrors than fire exits. Worse still, Marie Antoinette's reputation had no defense mechanism. Unlike modern celebrities who can release a notes app apology or hop on a podcast, she had no platform to correct the record. The royal press office was about as effective as a quill in a thunderstorm. Meanwhile, revolutionary agitators had pamphlets, newspapers, graffiti, and word of mouth, all faster, juicier, and easier to believe than whatever Versailles tried to spin in return. Even decades after her death, the myth endured. Scholars would occasionally clear their throats and say, actually, she never said, only to be ignored by everyone clutching their favorite quote like a frosted dagger. The cake quote became shorthand for arrogant monarchy, for ignorance in power, and for that one person in every crisis who says, why don't they just order takeout? In reality, Marie Antoinette was probably more worried than she let on. But the luxury, the detachment, and yes, the optics were too much to overcome. Let them eat cake was the ultimate death sentence by rumor. She didn't say it, but the people believed she could have, and that made all the difference. So the next time you hear someone quote it as fact, just remember, Marie Antoinette was many things, but a pastry-pushing villain wasn't one of them. The real tragedy. She was more a victim of bad PR than bad intentions. Unfortunately, history doesn't offer defamation lawyers for the beheaded. Imagine being the queen of a country where bread costs more than a week's wages. The peasants are rioting in the streets. The treasury is emptier than your husband's charisma. And every morning your advisors assure you, everything's fine, madame. Let's talk about wigs. Welcome to Marie Antoinette's reign in the final stretch. A masterclass in trying to solve a 5-alarm fire with glitter, denial, and terrible advice. The 1780s in France weren't just bad, they were apocalyptically, face-palmingly disastrous. The economy was collapsing mostly thanks to a perfect storm of bad harvests. Rising food prices, massive national debt, hello American Revolution, and a tax system that was so unfair, it might as well have been designed by a blindfolded raccoon. And the monarchy, instead of doing damage control, it rolled out the royal equivalent of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, then hosting a fireworks show on top of them. Louis XVI was paralyzed by indecision, and Marie Antoinette, well, she tried to help. She just happened to do it while wearing a hat shaped like a battleship. No, really, it was called the coiffure à la belle poule, a fashionable tower of hair and feathers, topped with a literal model warship, which the Queen proudly wore while France was economically belly-flopping. Her wardrobe in this era became infamous for its tone deafness. She dressed like a living symbol of luxury, at a time when the average citizen was trading their shoelaces for soup bones. But was Marie malicious? Not exactly. Out of touch? Absolutely. She'd been raised in the elite bubble of Austrian and French royalty, where the closest thing to hunger was running out of petit fours between courses, and Versailles didn't help. The palace was practically designed to shield royals from the unpleasantness of reality. Outside its gold-coated walls, people were dying from famine and cold. Inside, someone was probably complaining that the swan meat was slightly overcooked. Still, Marie did try to respond to the crisis, just not very well. When bread riots broke out in Paris, and the price of flour soared like a rocket made of gluten, she pushed her husband to back modest reforms. The problem? Her timing and optics were catastrophic. Every gesture she made seemed to be wrapped in lace, silk, and public confusion. And while she wasn't in control of the government, or even allowed to vote on policy, people blamed her anyway. She was too visible, too fashionable, too foreign, and far too easy to hate. And speaking of bad advice, enter the brain trust of Versailles. Marie Antoinette was surrounded by courtiers and nobles who made used car salesmen look like Nobel laureates. Many were sycophants, others were reactionary hardliners, and most were allergic to the concept of, let's maybe not antagonize the starving mob. Her closest confidants often urged her to double down. More luxury, more control, more silence in the face of unrest. Because nothing calms a revolution like ignoring it in designer shoes. To make matters worse, she didn't understand, or underestimated, the power of public perception. In an age where printed pamphlets and whispered rumors carried more weight than royal proclamations, Marie failed to build any kind of counter-narrative. She wasn't just absent from the public eye, She was a blank canvas onto which the angry people painted all their fury. Whether it was fair or not, didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, she was the villain wearing a pearl choker. Oh, and let's not forget her charity projects. Yes, she did give to the poor. She even donated to orphanages and sponsored hospitals, but that kind of quiet philanthropy doesn't compete well with diamond-encrusted gowns and silk wallpaper, worth more than most citizens' life savings. It's hard to get credit for feeding 5 peasants when you're photographed, sitting on enough fabric to clothe an entire province. And then there was the Trianon optics problem. She had her private retreat, the Petite Trianon, redecorated at enormous cost, complete with a fake peasant village where she could play shepherdess. Nothing screams relatable leader like cosplaying poverty while actual peasants die trying to grow food. If Marie Antoinette had an Instagram, her caption would have been, "Living my best simple farm girl life." By 1788, things had reached a boiling point. Inflation was so bad, you could basically use currency as kindling. The Estates General was being called for the first time in over 150 years. Bread riots weren't occasional. They were daily events, and yet the monarchy remained largely passive, hoping the storm would pass like an inconvenient drizzle, instead of the hurricane it was. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette, once called Madame Deficit by the press, became the unwilling face of everything wrong with the ancient regime. People no longer cared about the nuance, the complexity, or the hidden efforts she may have made behind the scenes. They just saw a queen who changed outfits 5 times a day while they couldn't afford breakfast. France was burning, and there she stood, graceful, composed, and holding the world's fanciest watering can, upside down. In the grand tradition of royal scandals, the diamond necklace affair wasn't just a rumor or a mildly embarrassing tabloid moment. It was a full-blown opera of fraud, deception, misplaced trust, and social combustion. And the worst part? Marie Antoinette wasn't even in on it. She didn't buy the necklace. She didn't want the necklace. But oh, she absolutely paid the price for it. Let's rewind to 1785. France was already a political pressure cooker. The economy was tanking, the poor were furious, and Versailles was about as popular as a wet slap. Then came a scandal so extravagant, so sparkling with literal diamonds, that it basically shoved Marie's already smouldering reputation directly into the revolutionary bonfire. The necklace itself? Let's talk about this monstrosity of bling. Commissioned in the 1770s by Louis XV, the king before Louis XVI, the one with even fewer scruples, this obscenely expensive diamond necklace featured around 647 diamonds and cost roughly 2 million livres, or in modern terms, enough to fund a small war, several hospitals, or bread for everyone. Not living in a golden palace. But Louis XV died before he could give it to his mistress, so the jewelers were left awkwardly holding this glittering megadebt like, who wants it now? They offered it to Marie Antoinette. Twice. She refused. She had style, sure, but even she wasn't going to wear a chandelier around her neck while the country's economy looked like an unraveling croissant. Plus, she wasn't exactly keen on wearing something originally meant for another woman, especially a mistress. Versailles was petty like that. So where's the scandal? Enter Jeanne de la Motte, a con artist with noble blood and zero shame. Jeanne decided to get rich, fast, by orchestrating a lie so ridiculous it shouldn't have worked. She convinced Cardinal de Rohan, a high-ranking clergyman, desperate to win Marie's favor, that the Queen secretly wanted the necklace. All he had to do was buy it for her. Discreetly, of course, and he'd be back in royal favor, faster than you could say. Terrible life choices. Jeanne forged letters, supposedly from Marie Antoinette herself. She even arranged a late-night secret meeting in the gardens of Versailles, where a prostitute dressed like the Queen handed the cardinal a rose and whispered sweet nothings. Rohan, proving that gullibility was alive and well in 18th century clergy, was sold. He bought the necklace from the jewelers and gave it to Jeanne, who promptly ran off with it, sold the diamonds, and went full catch me if you can. Now here's where it goes. Nuclear. The fraud came to light, and instead of handling it quietly, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette decided to drag the whole mess into the public eye. Rohan was arrested in front of the court of Versailles, in front of hundreds of nobles, for being duped by a woman cosplaying Marie behind a bush. The trial was a disaster. The Queen wanted to clear her name. The public saw something very different. A rich man was being arrested for thinking the Queen would secretly spend millions while they were starving, which to them seemed totally believable. That wasn't exoneration. That was confirmation. Worse yet, Rohan was acquitted. He got off with a slap on the wrist, and the public interpreted that as the Queen's trying to hide something. Pamphlets exploded. Cartoons were printed of Marie sneaking diamonds into her corset. Street performers mocked her. One popular satire even portrayed her as Cleopatra bathing in jewels, while Parisians drank gutter water. She didn't just lose a PR battle, she lost the war for public opinion. In reality, Marie Antoinette was innocent in the entire debacle. But this was a time when facts were boring, and drama sold better. Conspiracy theories ran rampant. The idea that a foreign, extravagant queen might secretly be bankrupting France behind the king's back fit the narrative too perfectly. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. And here's the grim irony. If Marie had just ignored the scandal, it might have faded away. But by demanding a public trial, she made sure everyone watched. She wanted justice. She got infamy. It was like suing someone for calling you a thief and ending up on a billboard labeled "steals things." This moment didn't just scar her, it branded her. It symbolized everything her enemies claimed, that she was greedy, secretive, and indifferent to the people's suffering. In reality, she had been trying to avoid luxury during the crisis, but the necklace affair became the final blow to her already crumbling reputation. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's this. You don't need to be guilty to be blamed, just unpopular enough. So did she ever wear the necklace? Nope. Did she order it? Not even close. But by the end of the scandal, she might as well have been wrapped in those diamonds and dragged through the streets like a piñata made of resentment. The people didn't care about the facts. They cared about the feeling. And by 1785, the feeling was fury. She didn't buy the necklace, but she definitely paid the price. If you thought the diamond necklace affair was the height of Marie Antoinette's bad luck, buckle up. That was just the opening act. Because in 1789, France decided it had finally had enough of monarchs wearing powdered wigs while everyone else was busy not eating. And how did the people choose to express their displeasure? They showed up, in person, with pitchforks. Let's set the stage. It's July 14th, 1789, a date now known worldwide as Bastille Day, or as Marie might have remembered it. Oh no, what now? The Bastille was a medieval fortress in Paris, originally built to defend the city, and later used as a prison. It held at the time of its storming 7 people. That's right. 7. More of a boutique prison, really. But this wasn't about numbers, it was about symbolism. The Bastille represented royal tyranny, absolute power, and the feeling that the king could lock anyone up, anytime just because he didn't like their vibe. So when the hungry, angry, and extremely overtaxed people of Paris heard rumours that King Louis XVI was planning to suppress the National Assembly with military force, they decided, let's break into a fortress, steal the weapons, and start this revolution properly. And thus, the French Revolution began with a very loud bang. Now remember where Marie Antoinette is in all this. Versailles, the palace, the bubble, a glorious gold-draped mirage that may as well have been on another planet from the people of Paris. While bread prices skyrocketed and unemployment soared, Versailles was still hosting royal dinners and fashion shows where your hat could double as an aircraft carrier. But the storming of the Bastille changed everything. It was like someone shook the snow globe of royal life, except the flakes were angry mobs. Still, Marie and Louis didn't fully grasp the seriousness of the moment. The king's first recorded reaction to the fall of the Bastille. "Is it a revolt?" he asked. "No, sire," his advisor famously replied. "It's a revolution." Spoiler alert, it would get worse. By October 1789, things were boiling over. Parisian women, primarily poor, working-class market ladies, had had it with high bread prices, starving children, and royal indifference. And they weren't going to write a letter or start a petition. No, they were going to walk to Versailles, all 12 miles, in the rain, with knives. What began as a march for bread turned into one of the most dramatic political protests in European history. The Women's March on Versailles, armed with kitchen tools, farming equipment, and the kind of rage only a hungry mother can generate. These women stormed the palace grounds demanding food, justice, and that the royal family moved to Paris, where the people could keep a closer eye on them. Imagine being Marie Antoinette, waking up to find thousands of furious bakers' wives on your lawn. Forget the nobles and powdered courtiers. These were women who had been elbow-deep in fish guts all morning, and still had the energy to storm a palace, and they meant business. In one of the more iconic moments, the crowd actually broke into the palace. There was bloodshed, panic, and a royal game of hide-and-seek. The queen was rushed to safety, guards were overwhelmed, and finally, the king did something unexpected. He gave in. Louis XVI agreed to leave Versailles and travel to Paris, not as a sovereign ruler, but as a very nervous guest of the revolution. The royal family was paraded back to the capital under heavy guard and heavier judgment. Their golden carriage wasn't pulled by horses, but by the rage of a nation. This was the moment where Marie Antoinette's world collapsed. Versailles, the palace of dreams, rituals, and status, was no longer a safe haven. It was a glittering prison that had just been overrun. The walk to Paris was not just a change of address. It was the symbolic fall of divine monarchy in France. To the people, this was sweet justice. To the queen, it was like being forced to move out of your mansion and into the basement, while being booed the whole way there. Even worse, her arrival in Paris was not greeted with flowers. The crowd mocked her, chanted, jeered. Rumors swirled that she had hoarded grain or bathed in milk while children starved. Did it matter that most of this wasn't true? Absolutely not. By now, Marie Antoinette wasn't a person. She was a punchline, a villain, a walking symbol of all that was wrong with France. Versailles, once the beating heart of royal power, was now just an echo of a toppled regime. The queen's gowns, jewels, and fan-flipping elegance meant nothing in a world where guillotines were trending. And in case you were wondering if the queen still had hope at this point, well, she did try to carry on with her dignity, but make no mistake, this was checkmate in slow motion. The palace was mobbed, the gates were open, the throne was dragged through the mud, literally, because when your palace gets mobbed by angry bakers' wives wielding bread knives, it's no longer a fashion show, it's a revolution. By 1791, Marie Antoinette had gone from Madame Deficit to Madame Dangerously close to the guillotine. After the royal family's forced relocation to Paris, their new residence, the Tuileries Palace, was less of a home and more of a slightly gilded holding cell. Yes, it had furniture. No, it did not have freedom. The king and queen were essentially house-arrested monarchs, watched, mocked, and dissected by a revolution that no longer found their fashion choices charming. But Marie Antoinette wasn't just going to sit there and knit, or rather, she didn't knit at all. Despite what revolutionary propaganda said, she had other ideas, big ones. Enter the Flight to Varennes, also known as How Not to Flee a Country 101. Let's paint the scene. The royal couple, increasingly nervous that the revolution was gaining momentum and guillotines, plotted an escape from Paris. The plan: disguise themselves, sneak out of the palace under cover of darkness, and rendezvous with royalist troops waiting near the border. Once safely in friendly territory, they'd trigger a counter-revolution and hopefully hit the undo button on this whole liberty, equality, fraternity mess. What could go wrong? A lot, actually. First, the disguises. Louis, dressed as a valet. Marie posed as a governess. Their children were bundled up like traveling peasants. Sounds clever, until you realize they also brought with them multiple royal attendants, a ridiculously large carriage, enough luggage to fill a small chateau, and Marie's insistence on riding in comfort, not stealth. Because if you're trying to sneak out of a country that wants to behead you, it's important to do so slowly, luxuriously, and in a coach that looks like it belongs to Cinderella. Unsurprisingly, they were recognized. The moment of doom came in a small town called Varennes. A local postmaster, who just happened to be a fan of revolutionary newspapers, thought the valet looked suspiciously like the guy on the front page who used to be king. He sounded the alarm, and the royal family was stopped and detained. The jig was up, the disguises were down, and the escape plan had the elegance of a bad high school play. The next day, a crowd of angry citizens escorted them back to Paris like a shame parade. People lined the streets, staring in silence. It wasn't the shouting or booing that was terrifying. It was the cold, disgusted quiet. The people weren't just angry anymore. They felt betrayed. The monarchy hadn't just lost its shine, it had lost its legitimacy. Marie Antoinette, once an icon of decadence, was now an outright enemy of the state. And unlike previous scandals, be they about diamonds, wigs, or parties, this one couldn't be laughed off. This was treason, and the punishment for treason during the French Revolution. Let's just say it wasn't community service. Now under strict arrest, the royal family became prisoners in their own land. The Tuileries Palace, transformed from a political cage into a full-on detention center. Marie's letters were monitored. Her friends were arrested. Her hair turned grey. Her eyes reportedly lost their spark. But her backbone? Still there. Whatever you may think of Marie Antoinette, one thing became clear. The woman had steel in her corset. In 1792, things went from bad to apocalyptic. The monarchy was formally abolished. The royal family was transferred to the Temple prison, a cold medieval fortress, where chamber pots replaced gilded mirrors. Louis XVI was separated from the family and put on trial, convicted, condemned, and guillotined. In January 1793, Marie's turn was coming, and when it did, it was brutal. Her trial in October 1793 was more political theatre than justice. The charges ranged from real to outrageous. She was accused of draining the treasury, colluding with foreign powers, planning counter-revolutionary plots, and most disturbingly of incest with her own son, a charge so grotesque that even the courtroom gasped. Marie denied the charges with what little voice she had left. When the incest accusation was read, she refused to dignify it with a detailed denial. She simply turned to the women of the audience and said, "If I have not answered, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge made to a mother." Even her harshest critics had to admit she went down with dignity. The jury, unsurprisingly, wasn't looking for truth. They were looking for justice in blood. On October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was found guilty and sentenced to death. From the palace to the prison to the courtroom, Marie had taken every wrong step she could. Her escape plan had failed. Her image was beyond repair. And now, all that remained was the final chapter. One that involved a very sharp blade and a very public farewell. She wasn't just a failed queen. She had become the revolution's ultimate cautionary tale, the embodiment of everything the people rose up to destroy. By October 1793, Marie Antoinette had lost everything. Her status, her children, her husband, her freedom, and most significantly, her grip on how the public saw her. Once the glittering Queen of France, she was now inmate number 280, in a threadbare black dress, trudging through the final act of a life that had gone from royal fairy tale to political horror show. Faster than you can say, Vive la Révolution. Her prison cell in the conciergerie was a far cry from Versailles. There were no silk sheets, no powdered courtiers, and definitely no chocolate fountains. Just a stone slab, 2 guards watching her every move, literally. They were instructed not to take their eyes off her at any time, and the tick-tick of revolutionary justice closing in. In the days leading up to her execution, Marie Antoinette was a woman worn to the bone. Her hair had turned fully white. Her health had deteriorated. And yet, when her death sentence was read, she stood tall, or at least as tall as one can stand after months of being publicly dragged through the mud and accused of crimes ranging from political treason to family-friendly tabloid garbage. On the morning of October 16, 1793, the Queen of France was given a final outfit, a plain white camise, the colour traditionally associated with purity and mourning. Gone were the opulent wigs, diamond tiaras and layers of lace. The woman who once inspired fashion riots now looked like someone auditioning for a ghost role in Hamlet. Only there was no encore performance after this one. Unlike her husband, who had been carted to the guillotine in a covered carriage, Marie was paraded through Paris in an open tumbril, a wooden cart used for hauling manure, or, in this case, queens. The revolutionaries wanted the people to get one last look at the symbol of their rage. The crowd jeered, of course, but some also stood in stunned silence. The once-hated monarch was now just a pale, hollow-eyed woman being driven to her death. At the Place de la Révolution, formerly Place Louis XV, and definitely not sponsored by royalty anymore, the guillotine waited, an invention of equality, but also efficiency. No matter your title or crimes, it promised the same thing, a sharp, democratic end. Marie climbed the steps to the scaffold with calm dignity. According to some accounts, she accidentally stepped on her executioner's foot and immediately apologized. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose. Say what you will about her reign, but even on her way to get beheaded, she had better manners than most people at a family reunion. Then came the drop. The blade fell. History blinked. And in that one moment, the monarchy died a very literal death. But Marie Antoinette didn't really disappear. She just changed forms. In the decades and centuries that followed, she became myth, villain, victim, fashion icon, cautionary tale. Whatever the world needed her to be, she became it. Let's be clear. The woman who once sat on a golden throne was no saint. She spent lavishly, failed to connect with her starving subjects, and trusted the wrong people at the worst times. But she also never said, "Let them eat cake." That quote had existed in political writings long before she was even born. It was later pinned on her like a sticky note of blame by revolutionaries eager to summarize their rage in 6 delicious syllables. And what a sticky note it was. The phrase stuck harder than a conspiracy theory on the internet. For generations, Marie Antoinette wasn't a person. She was a meme, a fancy villain who symbolized everything wrong with the old regime. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the narrative. And the narrative had her holding a frosted insult in one hand and a diamond tiara in the other. Only in the 19th and 20th centuries did historians start to peel back the layers. Letters surfaced. Diaries were published. The sanitized portraits painted during her life were compared to the grotesque caricatures that came later. And people began to realize, maybe Marie wasn't the monster. Maybe she was just a flawed, trapped teenager turned queen in an impossible situation. Someone crushed between centuries of privilege and a revolution hungry for heads. Modern portrayals have tried to reclaim her. Movies cast her as a misunderstood rebel. Biographies paint her as a prisoner of politics, culture, and a very poor PR team. Fashionistas celebrate her style. Feminist historians reevaluate her as a woman with almost no agency in a world that demanded she fix everything and blamed her when she couldn't. In the end, Marie Antoinette's real crime may have been being born in the wrong time, with the wrong accent, and the wrong wardrobe budget. So yes, she lost her head, and history, for a long time, completely lost its chill. But maybe now, centuries later, we can finally offer her a little fairness, a little context, a little truth between the wigs and the guillotines. And if nothing else, we can admit she never deserved to be remembered only for a cake quote she never said. In the grand halls of invention, some ideas are born of brilliance, others of desperation, and a rare few from the absolute failure to do the thing they were actually trying to do. Enter the humble post-it note, that neon square of passive-aggressive communication, your personal brain's external hard drive, and the thing you slap on your monitor to pretend you're organized. Its origin? A glue so bad, it succeeded. Let's rewind to the 1970s, at 3M. A company known for making everything from sandpaper to Scotch tape, basically the Home Depot of molecules. Enter one Dr. Spencer Silver, a chemist working in the 3M labs, who, like many scientists, was hoping to change the world with a revolutionary adhesive. What he invented instead was a glue that barely stuck to anything at all. Seriously, this was not superglue. This was underachiever glue. Silver had been trying to create an incredibly strong adhesive for aircraft construction, something that could keep metal stuck to more metal, ideally without plummeting from 30,000 feet. But what he got instead was a low-tack adhesive. It would stick lightly, peel off cleanly, and, crucially, re-stick again, repeatedly. It was the clingy ex-boyfriend of adhesives. Now, in most companies, this would be tossed out faster than a meeting invite, with mandatory fun in the subject line. But 3M had a weird little internal policy called the 15% rule, which allowed employees to spend part of their time working on their own ideas, the kind of quirky what-if zone that Silicon Valley now markets as innovation incubators, but which back then just looked like guys in lab coats playing with sticky stuff. Dr. Silver was convinced he was onto something. He started pitching his weak glue like a door-to-door vacuum salesman. It's not strong, he'd say, but it's very reusable. Most of 3M shrugged. One guy probably used it to stick his grocery list to the fridge and said, "Cool, but this isn't going to pay the shareholders." Then came the other half of this accidental genius duo, Art Fry, a 3M product developer, who sang in his church choir and had a very relatable problem. His bookmarks kept falling out of his hymnal during Sunday services. Now, most of us would just curse quietly and shove a sock in the book. But Art thought, wait, what about that weird glue my co-worker's been raving about for 5 years? So he slapped some of Silver's failed glue on the back of little paper slips. Suddenly, boom. Bookmarks that didn't fall out and didn't destroy the page when removed. Revolutionary. Art brought the idea back to 3M and pitched it as something new. Not a glue, not paper, but a sticky note. It was like an idea whisperer in office form. You could write on it, stick it, move it, and pretend you were totally keeping track of your deadlines. Still, corporate executives were not immediately sold. They launched it anyway, initially testing it under the name Press and Peel in 4 US cities. And the reaction? People didn't just like it, they started stealing it from each other's desks. You know your product is good when it inspires minor white-collar crime. By 1980, it was rebranded as Post-it notes, and the office supply world has never been the same. They came in yellow originally, because that was the only scrap paper color available at the time in the lab. Yellow, not because of any marketing plan, psychology of visibility or branding test. It was literally just what they had lying around. Of course, after the product exploded in popularity, 3M quickly tried to act like they totally meant for this to happen. Oh yes, the glue that barely works, that was our plan all along. Post-it notes became everything. Grocery lists, passive-aggressive roommate messages, love notes, hate notes, confessionals, the original tweet. Entire novels were planned with them, some written on them. Office walls became mosaics of procrastination. And let's not forget the cultural moment of Post-it bombing, where pranksters covered entire cars, desks, or even co-workers in a rainbow of notes, proving that even corporate tools can be fun if you have enough petty energy and lunch breaks. Post-it notes have also become symbols of brainstorming sessions everywhere. Need to look busy during a meeting? Write 3 vague goals on a few sticky notes, slap them on a whiteboard, and suddenly you're innovating. So there you have it. The Post-it note invented not because the glue was perfect, but because it wasn't. A mistake that became a multi-million-dollar success, proving once again that sometimes failure sticks. There's a fine line between genius and disaster, and that line is probably held together with superglue. Let's travel back to 1942. The world was in chaos. World War II was raging, and somewhere in a lab full of stressed-out scientists, and probably an alarming number of unventilated fumes, a chemist named Harry Coover stumbled upon a substance that was too good at what it did. Like, way too good. The mission, at the time, to develop a super clear plastic material for use in gun sights, so pilots could take aim without looking like they were squinting through a frosted bathroom window. Instead, what Coover discovered was a substance called cyanoacrylate. It was sticky, really sticky, like your little brother's fingers in a jar of peanut butter, levels of sticky. And you know what the military thought? Useless. That's right. They looked at this marvel of molecular grip and said, nah. Why? Because it stuck to everything. The test equipment, the technicians, possibly a sandwich someone left near the lab bench. You couldn't aim a gun sight if the gun was permanently attached to your face. So cyanoacrylate was shelved, put in a metaphorical drawer, labeled too annoying to deal with, along with other failed inventions like exploding chewing gum and polite internet comment sections. Fast forward to the 1950s, Harry Coover, who clearly had a talent for rediscovering his own forgotten breakthroughs, was now working at Eastman Kodak. Yes, Kodak. Because if there's anything that says cutting-edge glue tech, it's a company best known for your grandma's disposable vacation camera. While supervising a project involving heat-resistant polymers for jet canopies, again, military stuff, one of Coover's assistants accidentally glued 2 pieces of plastic together, with no heat, no pressure, no incantations or goat sacrifices, just a single drop of that old abandoned cyanoacrylate, and the bond? Immediate, permanent, like Vegas marriage levels of commitment. Suddenly, Harry realized he wasn't holding a failure, he was holding a miracle you couldn't unglue from your hand. Superglue was finally born, officially marketed in 1958 as Eastman 910. It was a product that did exactly what it said on the tin, and more. Need to fix a broken vase? Done. Seal a cracked shoe? Easy. Accidentally glue your fingers together and spend the afternoon Googling how to unstick my skin from itself. Welcome to the club. And it wasn't just a hit with hobbyists and model plane fanatics. Superglue quickly found applications in some extremely surprising places. For example, and no, this isn't a joke, it became a lifesaver during the Vietnam War. Medics started using it to close open wounds on the battlefield. A quick spray of cyanoacrylate would seal the wound and stop the bleeding, buying soldiers time to get to proper medical treatment. It wasn't FDA-approved surgery, but it was enough to stop you from leaking out on the jungle floor. So yes, superglue from this is unusable trash to combat medical miracle in under 2 decades. It didn't stop there. Industrial uses exploded. Superglue was used in electronics, aerospace, dentistry, don't ask, and even in crime scene investigations to lift fingerprints. It is the MacGyver of adhesives. It can fix shoes, repair statues, and ruin keyboards in a single drop. In fact, it became so ubiquitous that it practically became a rite of passage. If you've never glued your thumb to a coffee mug, have you even lived? But what made it so powerful? The science behind cyanoacrylate is elegantly terrifying. The glue reacts almost instantly with moisture, even the tiny bit present in the air or on your skin. When it contacts water, it polymerizes, forming long chains that create a super strong bond. Basically, superglue sees a droplet of humidity and goes full Hulk mode. This is also why it works so well on things you didn't want it to, like your fingers, your tabletop, or the cat's whiskers, if you're having a really bad day. Of course, with great stickiness comes great responsibility. Warnings were slapped onto every tube. Avoid contact with skin. Keep away from eyes. Do not attempt to glue your ex's belongings to the ceiling, even if it feels justified. Okay, maybe not that last one, but it should be there. As for Harry Coover, he became known as the father of superglue, a title only slightly less glamorous than, say, father of electricity or inventor of pizza, but certainly more adhesive. He went on to hold over 460 patents and lived long enough to see his failed invention earn him the National Medal of Technology and Innovation from President Obama in 2010. Superglue, like so many great inventions, wasn't made by following a perfect plan. It was the result of a scientific accident, one that stuck around, literally, because sometimes the things we throw away as too flawed, too weird, or too inconvenient turn out to be exactly what the world needs. Just maybe don't use it to reattach your kid's loose tooth. If you've ever unboxed a package and immediately forgotten what you ordered because you were too busy popping every bubble on the wrap, congratulations, you've experienced the most satisfying failure in interior decorating history. Let's rewind to 1957, the golden age of chrome furniture, pastel kitchen appliances, and deeply questionable home decor ideas. This was the era where people genuinely thought avocado green was a good color for bathrooms. Enter Alfred Fielding and Mark Chavannes, two inventors who thought, what if your walls were textured? And by textured, they meant plastic. More specifically, a kind of 3D plastic wallpaper that was soft, cushiony, and looked like the future. If the future were designed by toddlers with a lot of bubble wrap and no sense of restraint. Fielding and Chavannes took 2 shower curtains, sealed them together in a way that trapped air bubbles, and voila, they had invented the ugliest wallpaper ever conceived by man. But hey, it was modern, futuristic, a little puffy. Just imagine walking into your friend's house and seeing an entire living room covered in bubble walls, like living inside a giant sheet of packing material. Very space age, very might suffocate in your sleep. Shockingly, the interior design world said no thanks. Wallpaper manufacturers blinked politely and backed away slowly, and the dream of turning homes into plastic airbag rooms popped faster than, well, you get it. Most people didn't want their house to look like it was wrapped by Amazon Prime. So Fielding and Chavannes pivoted, because if you're going to fail in one market, fail upwards. Next, they tried to sell bubble wrap as insulation for greenhouses. Again, solid logic. It traps air, it's light, and technically it does offer some insulation. But unfortunately, greenhouse owners weren't ready to take landscaping advice from 2 guys who just lost a fistfight with wallpaper. Sales were lukewarm, and so were the tomatoes. It wasn't until 1960 that the light bulb, or maybe the bubble, finally popped over someone's head. Enter IBM. Yes, the computer company, who were gearing up to launch their brand new 1401 computer system, which was, at the time, a marvel of business computing, and weighed roughly as much as a Volkswagen Beetle. These machines were fragile, expensive, and required the kind of careful packaging usually reserved for Fabergé eggs and IKEA furniture that's already falling apart. IBM needed a way to keep these digital beasts from arriving in pieces. Fielding and Chavans pitched their bubbly invention one more time, not as wallpaper, not as insulation, but as packaging. And for once, the answer wasn't "this is ridiculous," but "this is brilliant." Suddenly, bubble wrap became the unsung hero of shipping and logistics. From computer components to glassware to your very fragile self-esteem, after opening an Amazon box filled with nothing but disappointment and 27 feet of plastic air pillows, bubble wrap was there. It protected, it cushioned, it comforted, it became the soft armor of modern consumerism. And let's be honest, half the appeal was never about protection. It was always about the popping. Yes, this accident of a product, this failed wall decor, gave humanity the greatest stress toy ever invented. Each little bubble, a tiny promise of satisfaction, a physical pop to match your mental snap. Studies, and also the entire internet, have shown that popping bubble wrap can reduce stress, probably because it allows you to exert power over something, or maybe because it's the only thing in your life that offers immediate results without a Wi-Fi connection. Eventually, bubble wrap became so iconic, it spawned spin-offs. There's anti-static bubble wrap for electronics, bubble wrap with bigger bubbles for heavy-duty packages, even colored bubble wrap, because if you're going to destroy plastic air pockets with gleeful abandon, why not do it in pink? There's also an official Bubble Wrap Appreciation Day, celebrated on the last Monday of January. How does one celebrate? Popping, obviously. In fact, Guinness World Records were broken for the most people simultaneously popping bubble wrap, because humans are amazing creatures with simple needs. And let's not forget the digital age, where bubble wrap went virtual. Apps that simulate popping, websites dedicated to virtual sheets. You know, an invention has transcended its packaging purpose, when bored office workers can spend hours pretending to pop something that isn't even real. What's truly beautiful about the story of bubble wrap is its resilience. It failed, then it failed again, and then it popped into history not through the design world, but because someone realized its best feature wasn't aesthetics, it was utility. Sometimes the best inventions aren't the ones that succeed immediately, they're the ones that refuse to stay in the recycling bin. So next time you pop a bubble, or 37 in a row while pretending you're just testing the package, remember that satisfying snap is the sound of a dream that failed upwards. Some inventions are born from genius, some are born from long nights in the lab, and some are born because a man's pocket got suspiciously gooey. Enter Percy Spencer, radar engineer, war tech wizard, and accidental snack chef. Let's set the stage. It's the 1940s. World War II is in full swing, and while the rest of the world is ducking bombs and rationing sugar, Percy Spencer is hanging around at Raytheon, one of the companies developing advanced radar technology for the US military. Radar, for the record, was the real MVP of the war, detecting planes, submarines, and occasionally, as it turns out, cooking food. Now Percy was no ordinary button pusher. He was one of those rare breeds of self-taught geniuses who could build complex machines before most people figured out which end of a screwdriver to hold. And like any true engineer, he had a sweet tooth. One day, while standing in front of a magnetron, a crucial radar component that emits high-frequency microwaves, Percy noticed something strange. The chocolate bar in his pocket was melting, not just a little soft. Not, "Oops, I sat on it during a staff meeting." Melted. No, this was full-on, fudge fountain, Willy Wonka's nightmare levels of goo. Now, most people would think, wow, what a mess, I need new pants. But Percy thought, interesting, let's try cheese next. And he did. He ran straight to the lab kitchen. Every good lab has cheese lying around, obviously, and put a piece of cheddar near the magnetron. The cheese bubbled and spat like it was auditioning for a grilled cheese sandwich commercial. Then he grabbed popcorn. It popped, without a stove, without fire, without logic. Spencer had stumbled, quite literally, upon a revolutionary idea: cooking food with radar waves, more precisely, using microwaves, a type of electromagnetic radiation that, it turns out can agitate water molecules and heat food from the inside out. And so began the very strange birth of the microwave oven. But hold your applause, because the first microwave ovens were less kitchen convenience and more kitchen kaiju. The first prototype Percy built stood nearly 6 feet tall, weighed over 750 pounds, and required a cooling system just to prevent it from vaporizing your lunch and your countertop. You didn't so much reheat a meal as you summoned the sun. Also, it cost about $5,000 in 1940s money, or roughly the GDP of a small island nation. Still, the concept was sound. Food inside, microwaves bounce around, molecules vibrate, things get hot. Science, baby. By 1947, Raytheon had a product, the Raider range, the first commercial microwave oven. It was mostly used in restaurants and battleships, places that needed to cook large quantities of food quickly, and had no qualms about appliances that looked like a vending machine mated with a nuclear reactor. But as with all bizarre prototypes, time and capitalism worked their magic. By the 1960s, the microwave shrunk in size, price, and general scariness. And by the 1970s, it became the crown jewel of suburban kitchens everywhere. Why spend hours cooking when you could press a button and vaporize a hot pocket? The microwave became a symbol of modernity, of convenience, of speed, of the kind of culinary choices that required no supervision and barely any ingredients. It was the gateway drug to TV dinners, instant noodles, and leftover pizza that somehow came out hotter than the surface of the sun in one spot and frozen in another. Truly, it was chaos in a box. But we loved it anyway. And don't forget the folklore. Every microwave owner has, at some point, learned these essential truths the hard way. Don't microwave metal unless you want to recreate the 4th of July indoors. Don't microwave eggs unless you enjoy spontaneous protein explosions. Don't trust the defrost button. It's a liar. Over the decades, the microwave has gone from a nuclear-powered chocolate assassin to a kitchen staple so common it's more likely to be found in college dorms than actual textbooks. And yes, it still holds a unique place in pop culture, from popcorn button memes to those time-lapse videos where people microwave soap or Peeps just to watch them grow into monsters. But it all started because one guy stood too close to a piece of military equipment with a candy bar in his pocket. Percy Spencer never patented the microwave himself. He was a humble employee, and Raytheon owned the rights. But he did receive a $2 bonus. That's right, $2 whole dollars, for inventing the thing that now makes 3 a.m. burrito dreams come true. So the next time you hear that familiar dings, remember that hot plate of leftovers is powered by a series of events that began with a melted chocolate bar, a whole lot of curiosity, and one engineer who looked at snack-filled pants and thought, what if you ever doubted that a leisurely stroll through nature with your dog could change the course of human history, then you've clearly never met Swiss engineer George de Mestral or his very patient, very burr-covered dog. The year was 1941, and de Mestral, a 34-year-old inventor with an eye for detail and a wardrobe for hiking, was enjoying a simple walk in the countryside near Geneva. It was one of those tranquil days where the sun filters through the trees, birds sing like they're auditioning for Disney, and snap, nature smacks you in the ankle with something awful. That something awful was the burr, those annoying spiky seed pods that cling to your socks, pants, shoelaces, and in George's case, the entire tail region of his dog. It was like the plant kingdom's idea of a practical joke. Now most people would curse, yank them off, and move on with their lives. But George de Mestral was not most people. He was an engineer, the kind of person who looks at a clingy seed and thinks, this is annoying, but kind of brilliant. Back at home, instead of grabbing tweezers and swearing under his breath like a normal person, de Mestral grabbed a microscope. Under the lens, he noticed something fascinating. The burrs were covered in tiny hooks, and these hooks clung perfectly to the loops of fabric and fur. They weren't sticky, they weren't magical, they were just mechanically clever, like nature's own brand of Lego. And thus began George's years-long quest to recreate the burr. Yes, he spent years trying to mass-produce what plants figured out by accident. He had the concept, hook and loop, but turning that into a usable product was like trying to teach a porcupine to sew. The early attempts were ambitious. He tried different fabrics. He tried cutting tiny hooks into cotton, He tried convincing people that burr-inspired clothing fasteners were the future. Most of the time, he just got weird looks and a lot of polite, "That's nice, dear," from business executives. But George persisted because he had Swiss engineer energy, powered by precision, stubbornness, and probably a lot of fondue. He eventually switched from cotton to nylon, which was a game changer. Nylon could be shaped with heat and retained its form, perfect for crafting those tiny, clingy hooks. By 1955, after 14 years of trial, error, and microscopic obsession, de Mestral patented his creation. He named it Velcro, a combination of velvet and crochet, which sounds like a cozy knitting party, but turned out to be a revolution in fastening technology. Still, the fashion industry wasn't exactly thrilled. Early Velcro prototypes looked more like the stuff you'd use to hold down a tarp during a hurricane than anything that belonged on couture gowns. Tailors and designers were skeptical. Zippers still reigned supreme. Buttons were deeply offended. And Velcro, it sounded like something you'd find in a toolbox, not a boutique. But then, as often happens in stories like this, NASA showed up. The space race was in full swing, and astronauts needed fasteners that worked in zero gravity, where zippers are fiddly and buttons are a nightmare. Velcro, it was like space duct tape, easy to use, lightweight and functional, even when floating. NASA used it to secure equipment, hold down food trays and keep pens from playing hide-and-seek in orbit. That endorsement changed everything. If it was good enough for astronauts, it was good enough for Earthlings. Soon, Velcro was showing up on ski gear, diving suits, and the shoes of every child who hadn't yet mastered the art of tying laces, which, let's be honest, included most adults before coffee. Hospitals used it for medical braces, factories used it to hold up tools, and parents everywhere rejoiced at not having to double knot sneakers before every school run. And what began as a countryside annoyance became a staple of modern convenience. De Mestral's invention took a plant's evolutionary defense mechanism and turned it into a fastening empire. The burr, in all its clingy glory, had gone corporate. But the story doesn't end with utility. Velcro also became a kind of cultural icon. It made that rip-rip sound, the universal noise of childhood rebellion, orthopedic sneakers, and someone trying not to wake up a roommate. It became synonymous with simplicity, adaptability, and speed. Ironically, Velcro's biggest struggle today is with its own success. Much like Kleenex or Google, people use the name Velcro to describe all hook and loop fasteners, even if they're cheap knockoffs. In fact, the original Velcro brand has had to launch entire marketing campaigns begging people to call the generic stuff hook and loop to avoid losing their trademark. So next time you slap on a blood pressure cuff, rip open your sneakers, or strap something into place with a satisfying sound, take a moment to thank one curious Swiss engineer, one extremely burr-covered dog, and one plant that decided it was tired of going unnoticed. Because sometimes, innovation isn't born in the lab. Sometimes it's born in the middle of a hike, when nature reaches out, sticks to your pants, and whispers, "Patent me."